Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam with Historic Travels, and as always, before we get started, I just need to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subscribers and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the Historic Travels YouTube channel a little bit more, there is a Patreon in the description, so guys, if you'd like to go check that out, that's awesome. And if you would also like to check out our merchandise store, there's another link for that in the description as well. Thank you guys so much. And okay guys, so real quick, before we get started, I just need to let you all know that the video that you are about to watch is a massive documentary film that was made from using all the individual episodes of the whole Titanic timeline series that I made during the month of April. This video is essentially every single episode in that timeline series compiled into one massive video. So if you see me wearing different clothes in between shots and stuff like that, you'll know you jumped from episode 1 to episode 2 to episode 3 and so on and so forth. So this film covers the Titanic timeline from the moment the ship left Belfast all the way up to right when the Titanic made her final plunge. And eventually I am going to get started on another timeline covering the series of events that occurred after the Titanic sunk, like the Carpathia, the inquiries, etc., etc. But that will come a little bit later, and just like this, it'll be released in episodes, episode 1, episode 2, episode 3, and then when it's all said and done, we'll release it as one giant documentary film, just like we did with this one. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoy, and yeah, guys, keep doing what you do. You guys are awesome, and all right, guys, well, hey, enjoy the movie. On this day, on April 2nd, 1912, the RMS Titanic is getting ready to leave Belfast. On this day, she was completing her sea trials, and then once those sea trials were complete, she would head back to Belfast to pick up the last of the crew, and then she would depart for Southampton to begin prepping for her maiden voyage. April 2nd was a very busy day for the RMS Titanic and the White Star Line. You see, the White Star Line had to get the Titanic sea trials completed, and then right after that, the Titanic would leave Belfast, the city of her birth, and make way for Southampton, where she would begin preparations for the maiden voyage. So they had a very short window of time here to get the Titanic certified and to get her underway as quickly and safely as possible. So what exactly are sea trials? Well, sea trials are what any new vessel like the Titanic has to undertake in order to prove under law that she is, a safe and well-built vessel. Think of it like a restaurant having a health inspection or something. So essentially what happens during a sea trial is somebody from the Board of Trade comes aboard the ship, they take the Titanic out into the bay, and then they run the ship through its paces. They accelerate the ship to full speed, then they time how long it takes the Titanic to stop, they test its maneuverability, like how long it takes the ship to turn. They run the ship through its paces, so to speak. And you see, this is very important because if the Titanic does not get certified, then she will not be able to proceed to Southampton for her maiden voyage. But this wouldn't be an issue for the RMS Titanic. Every single test they put the ship under, she passed with flying colors. So what were some of these tests that they did? Well, one of the first things they did was accelerate the Titanic up to a speed of 20 knots, and then once they saw that she could handle this speed no problem, they wanted to time or see the distance that it would take the Titanic to stop if they reversed the engines. And once they did this, the Titanic stopped in just 850 yards, which was more than acceptable. So that proved that the Titanic could stop pretty quickly if it needed to. Another test that they did was they wanted to see how wide of a circle the Titanic would make if they turned the ship hard to starboard and just had the ship turn and do a complete loop. How much room would it take for the ship to do a complete lap? Well, the Titanic took 3,850 yards to complete one circle, which was very acceptable for a ship of the Titanic's size. So at this point, the Titanic safety certificate was signed, and the ship was free to carry on to Southampton for her maiden voyage. Now, it took the Titanic around 6 hours to complete all of her sea trials, and once this was done, her safety certificate was signed by the Board of Trade, and the Titanic was free to leave Belfast. Now, in recent years, some people have pointed out that 6 hours was not enough time for the Titanic to do all of her sea trials, and that maybe if she would have had more time and they had been a little bit more cautious with the sea trials or taken more steps, maybe the Titanic wouldn't have sunk. However, I'm mixed feeling about that. You see, you got to remember, it wasn't a member of the White Star Line that was on board the ship that was conducting the ship's safety tests. It was a member of the Board of Trade. And they wouldn't have signed off on the Titanic safety certificate if they did not feel that the Titanic was safe and ready to take on the world. So, I mean, sure, having more sea trials would be better. It could help you train the crew more, get them more familiar with the ship. But with the time they had and with the time frame for the maiden voyage, I think they did a reasonably good job considering what they were working with at the time. On the evening of April 2nd, the RMS Titanic was now preparing to leave the city of her birth for good, and at this point, a special group of men was preparing to board the ship. These men were known as the Titanic's Guarantee Group. They were a select few people who helped build the Titanic, whose job it would be on the maiden voyage to help troubleshoot the ship. So if any problems would occur during the voyage, they would be on board to deal with the problems and try to fix the ship and help make the crossing of the Titanic as safe and as perfect as possible. I was just going to briefly mention the Guarantee Group in this episode and just kind of briefly talk about them a little bit. However, I decided that I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is make a dedicated video just talking about the Guarantee Group, because honestly, these men deserve their own video. I really believe that because they were on board, so many more people ended up surviving the Titanic disaster. I think if they hadn't have been there, the sinking could have played out very differently, and I think we could have had a greater loss of life than what we really did see with the Titanic. I will say this though, there was one member of the Guarantee Group, and his name was Thomas Andrews. And Thomas Andrews was one of the key designers of the RMS Titanic. He knew the ship better than anyone. And he was on board the ship the night she went down. Unfortunately, he would not survive the sinking, but his actions that night really did save lives. Not just with helping people get to the lifeboats, but you see, he was the one who determined that the Titanic was sinking. And you see, even with his vast knowledge of the ship, it still took him close to an hour to say, yeah, we're done, we have to evacuate. If he hadn't have been on board the ship, who knows how long it would have taken anybody else to figure out that the Titanic was sinking. And honestly, if they had even a little bit more of a delay, who knows if they would have been able to get all the lifeboats off the ship. Sure, collapsible A and B had to float off, but they did successfully launch all of Titanic's regular lifeboats and 2 collapsibles. I honestly think if Thomas Andrews hadn't have been on board the ship that night, I don't think they would have had time to launch the lifeboats that they did. Alright guys, well hey, we are now on day 2 of Titanic month. Well, technically it's April 3rd, but day 2 in the Titanic timeline that we're covering. On this day, 109 years ago, the RMS Titanic arrived in the city where it was going to be picking up all of its passengers, its crew, you know. Now the Titanic would make a few other stops before it headed out to sea, but this was the main place where the ship was going to be getting prepped and made ready for her maiden voyage. This city was the city of Southampton. And when the Titanic arrived in Southampton, they had right around a week or so to prep the ship and get it ready for its maiden voyage. So it was all hands on deck for the White Star Line and the Titanic, so to speak, and yes, pun intended. The city of Southampton, located at the southern tip of the United Kingdom, is where the RMS Titanic went to undergo her final preparations and in order for the ship to get everything ready that the vessel would need for her maiden voyage. This included the ship's cargo, food, coal, etc., etc. But of course, the most important thing that the ship would pick up here was most of the crew that would be serving on board the ship. You see, of the 908 crew members that were on board the RMS Titanic during the maiden voyage, 724 of them were originally from Southampton. So just think about how this city must have been impacted by the sinking of the RMS Titanic. I mean, honestly, I can't even imagine it. But now, we're not getting to that yet. Let's go back to the preparations for this ship and talk about some of the incredible tasks that the White Star Line and the people that were working on this ship had to do in order to prep the Titanic for its maiden voyage. So what is one of the most important things you need on a ship like the Titanic in order to make sure all the passengers and crew on board are comfortable and happy? Well, you need food. How much food do you think that the White Star Line had to load on the Titanic in just a week's time? Well, I'm going to tell you, and honestly, the numbers blew my mind. I knew it was going to be a lot, but just how much food was on board the Titanic, I couldn't get over it. So this is all pulled up from Google. The Titanic had 75,000 pounds of meat, holy cow, 11,000 pounds of fish, 80,000 pounds of potatoes, holy, 40,000 eggs, 7,000 heads of lettuce, 10,000 pounds of sugar, 250 barrels of flour, 36,000 apples, 1,500 gallons of milk, and of course, 15,000 bottles of ale. You gotta have ale, of course you do. So yeah, just think about how much food they had to load on board the Titanic just to take care of everybody that's on board. Those numbers are absolutely mind-blowing to me. I can't even imagine the scale of food that they would need on modern-day cruise ships that sail today.
So what's another important thing that a ship like the Titanic would need for its maiden voyage? Well, fuel for its engines, of course. You see, the Titanic was powered by coal. Essentially, what they would do is they would put coal into the ship's massive boilers, the fires in the boilers would burn the coal, and then that in turn would create steam. That is what the Titanic used to propel itself across the Atlantic. The Titanic, just like all other ships of the period, was a steam-powered ocean liner.
Now, when I say the Titanic needed coal for its voyage, it needed a lot of coal for the trip. Under full load, the Titanic could hold around 6,500, 6,600 tons of coal. So that's a lot of coal. But why did it need so much? Well, there's two things you have to keep in mind. Number one is the distance between Southampton to New York City. That's around 3,000 miles. And number two, the Titanic would basically travel 1 mile for every ton of coal that she used. So 1 ton of coal equaled 1 mile of distance or travel distance for the Titanic. So that meant it basically only had enough fuel on board for one trip from Southampton to New York, and then one trip from New York back to Southampton. That's a ton of coal for just one trip across and one trip back.
However, getting all the coal the Titanic would need for its maiden voyage wasn't going to be so easy for the White Star Line. You see, the whole country of the United Kingdom had experienced a massive coal strike that was only resolved on April 6th, while the Titanic was still in Southampton. So, because of this coal strike, there was a massive shortage of coal available for the RMS Titanic. But the White Star Line was not going to let their brand new ship miss its maiden voyage just on account of a coal strike. So what they ended up doing was transferring coal from other vessels that were going to be sailing and essentially giving that coal to the Titanic. Now, because the White Star Line actually did this, some of the passengers on those vessels actually got transferred to the Titanic for its maiden voyage because their vessels had surrendered their coal to the Titanic.
Boy, I tell you, just from doing research for this video and just seeing all the stuff that they had to do in Southampton to get the RMS Titanic ready to go for its voyage, loading all the crew on board, the coal, the food, I mean, honestly, I'm sure they were scrambling, just trying to get everything done as quickly as possible for this ship's maiden voyage. I mean, and just think about the coal strike, having to move coal from other vessels just to get the Titanic ready to go for its maiden voyage. I mean, talk about cutting it close. I don't know how they did it in 1 week. And, they were still trying to get people to come and work on the ship during that time as well. So it really was all hands on deck, so to speak, for the Titanic and the White Star Line during that week that the Titanic was in Southampton getting prepped for its maiden voyage.
April 10th, 1912. If you're somebody who studies the Titanic, then you'll know why this date is such a big deal. You see, on this day, 109 years ago, the RMS Titanic departed Southampton, England to begin her maiden voyage. But you see, what many people don't know is that it really wasn't that big a deal for the people at Southampton. You see, when people today think about the Titanic departing, they think it was like a big celebration for the people in the town. They were celebrating, there was a big party, Titanic was the biggest ship in the world. But you see, to the people of Southampton, the Titanic was kind of old news. You see, the Titanic was the near identical sister ship to the RMS Olympic. So if there would have been a big party or celebration, it would have been for the Olympic, not the Titanic.
Now, I can already hear all of you guys in the comments going, what do you mean they didn't care that much about Titanic? Titanic was the biggest ship in the world. And while, yes, you are right, you have to remember the whole thrill of the Olympic class had died down after the Titanic sister ship, the Olympic, was built. You see, if there was any kind of party, as I said earlier, it would have happened during the Olympics time. The best way I could describe it using modern day ships would probably be looking at the Royal Caribbean Oasis class ships. You see, when the Royal Caribbean built their ship, the Oasis of the Seas, it was the biggest ship in the world. Everybody celebrated like, oh, look at this revolutionary new ship. And then Royal Caribbean came out with Allure of the Seas, a little bigger, better than Oasis. But you see, by then, the whole thrill of the Oasis class ships had died down. See, even right now, I still want to sail on the Oasis. I'm sure the Allure is, nicer, but honestly, I want to check out the Oasis, the first ship of the class. So it was a similar concept with the Olympic and Titanic. Titanic didn't become famous until after she unfortunately sank.
But to the people that were sailing on the Titanic, it didn't matter to them that she wasn't really the star of the show. You see, to them, the fact that they were on this brand new vessel, it was the biggest ship in the world, it was the maiden voyage, there was a huge thrill to be part of such a big moment in history. And what many people don't realize is that the Titanic had a good number of passengers that weren't supposed to be on board the ship at all.
As Titanic was being prepared for its maiden voyage, there was a massive coal strike underway in the entire United Kingdom. And this coal strike had only been resolved a few days before the Titanic was due to depart on its maiden voyage. And because this happened, there was a shortage of coal available to the ships that were going to be making the transatlantic route. There wasn't really even enough coal for the Titanic to complete its maiden voyage. But you see, the White Star Line didn't want that. They wanted the ship to be able to do its maiden voyage. And what they did was they worked this out with other ships, and other ships actually transferred their coal to the RMS Titanic. And this actually worked out in favor for the Titanic because the Titanic was underbooked for the maiden voyage. So these ships transferred their passengers over to the Titanic. So there was a good number of passengers on board the Titanic, as I said earlier, that should have never been there in the first place.
As the last of the passengers were loaded on board the RMS Titanic, at exactly 12 noon on April 10th, 1912, the RMS Titanic was pulled away from the docks by a bunch of tugboats that were in the area, and she fired up her main engines to begin her maiden voyage across the Atlantic, with a grand total of 2,200 souls on board.
As soon as the RMS Titanic engaged her main engines and began to pull out of Southampton Harbor, a near disaster almost struck the Titanic. Now, what exactly happened? Well, from the crew on board and the passengers' perspective, they were just watching the ship pull out of the harbor, waving to their family and friends back on land, and they heard several loud snaps. In quick recession, it was like snap, 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 and they had no clue what it was. Some people said it sounded like gunshots. So everybody on the deck, the deck officers, the passengers, rushed to the side of the Titanic in order to try to figure out what was going on. Was somebody shooting at them? They didn't know. And when they found the source to these sounds, what they saw horrified them.
The snapping sounds that people on the Titanic were hearing were actually the mooring lines for another vessel called the New York, which was docked right beside Titanic, breaking off and snapping. Essentially what mooring lines are, they're giant rope that hold a vessel to a dock or pier. So essentially what had ended up happening was, as the Titanic was leaving the dock and it turned on its massive engines, the suction created by these engines was enough to break the mooring lines holding the New York to the pier, causing the ship to be sucked towards the Titanic, threatening a collision. But due to quick action by Captain Smith and several tugboats in the area, they were able to just avoid a collision. But when I say they avoided a collision, I mean just barely. It was really a miracle that the Titanic and the New York did not hit each other as the ship was leaving.
When you think about it in retrospect, if the Titanic and the New York had in fact hit each other that day, then I'd say there's a pretty good chance the Titanic might have never sunk. Because, think about it. If the damage between the New York and the Titanic would have been severe enough, it would have delayed the Titanic's maiden voyage. And while they were undergoing repairs, the iceberg would have drifted further away and the Titanic might have never hit it. Interesting to think about. But anyway, back to what really happened. So after the near miss, the crew on the Titanic did a quick inspection of the ship just to make sure that everything was okay. And it was, since the two vessels didn't hit. It just scared everybody. But this near miss delayed the Titanic's maiden voyage by about a half hour. And once all the inspections were done, the Titanic fired up its engines again and finally departed Southampton. The Titanic's next stop was Cherbourg, France, which it would arrive at later that evening.
It took just 6 hours for the Titanic to make the journey from Southampton, England to Cherbourg, France. The Titanic pulled into Cherbourg right around 6:30 p.m. on the same day, April 10, 1912. However, when the Titanic arrived, the ship was way too big to pull up to the dock in Cherbourg, so they sent 2 tender boats called the Nomadic and the Traffic out to the Titanic in order to drop off passengers, cargo, and bring a few passengers from the Titanic to land, as several passengers on board the Titanic just wanted to make the voyage from Southampton to Cherbourg and not go all the way to America.
Some pretty noteworthy passengers ended up boarding the Titanic while it was docked in Cherbourg, several of which include Margaret Brown and John Jacob Astor. Both of them got on board while the ship was at this port. Now, the Titanic didn't stay in Cherbourg for very long, only about 2 hours. That's all the time it took to load on board all the passengers from the Nomadic and the Traffic, get any cargo on board, and to offload any passengers on the Titanic that were just heading over to France. And at around 8:10 p.m., the Titanic raised anchor and departed Cherbourg, France. With one last stop, its next stop would be Queenstown, Ireland. Once the Titanic completed its stop there the next day, the ship would then head out to sea for its first transatlantic crossing to America. So for today's video, we are actually going to be covering the Titanic Sea Days. So we already made a video covering the events of April 10th when the Titanic left Southampton, went to Cherbourg, and then carried on. And we're going to start this video on April 11th and go up to the evening of April 14th, right up to the iceberg impact. In the video that I'm going to make covering the actual sinking, we're going to talk about the iceberg impact and then all the events of the sinking. For this video, we're just going to cover the Titanic Sea Days and note any worthwhile events that may have occurred on each of those days.
April 11th, 1912. The RMS Titanic, after traveling overnight from Cherbourg, France, arrived in Queenstown, Ireland in the morning of this day. Once it got to Queenstown, Ireland, it was planning to drop off a few passengers and pick up around 200 more passengers that were leaving from Ireland bound for America.
April 11, 1912 was a pretty routine day on board the RMS Titanic. Not that many eventful things did occur. One thing of note is that when the Titanic was actually about to pull into Queenstown, it does seem that they actually put the ship through some maneuverability tests. Like they had the ship do these big turns and stuff like that just to kind of test the ship, so that's pretty interesting. But now when the Titanic arrived in Queenstown, even though the Titanic could fit at the dock, they decided instead to keep the Titanic kind of out in the bay of Queenstown and have a ferry come out and bring passengers, cargo, take any passengers from the Titanic to land. They decided to do that instead of having the ship pull all the way up to the pier. And this was because they wanted a quicker turnaround time. So if the Titanic would have pulled all the way up to the pier and docked, then it would have taken longer for them to pull the ship out, get the Titanic turned around and get it headed back out to sea. But so by keeping the ship out in the bay and having ferries bring people, cargo, passengers, etc. onto the Titanic, this would greatly accelerate how much time it would take to get the Titanic back underway once dealing with all the passengers was complete.
One other interesting thing did happen before the Titanic left Queenstown. You see, as the Titanic was unloading the last of its passengers that were heading over to Queenstown, one crew member on board the ship who actually signed up to work on the Titanic from Southampton and go all the way to America and basically be with the Titanic for its entire voyage, decided to jump ship while the Titanic was in Queenstown. So essentially what he did was he said he was going to work on the Titanic just so he could get free passage from Southampton to Ireland, which is honestly kind of funny when you think about it. Around 1:30 p.m. in the afternoon, the Titanic finally left Queenstown, Ireland, bound for the United States. This photo you see right here is one of the final photos taken of the RMS Titanic, quite possibly the last photo ever taken of this ship. But yep, once all the passengers left the Titanic and all the new passengers got on board, the Titanic weighed anchor and sailed off into the unknown for its maiden voyage. After the Titanic left Queenstown, the rest of the day went pretty much without incident, The passengers got settled on board, everybody was just getting ready for their daily routine, and they were just gearing up to enjoy the voyage. So the next day on board the Titanic will be April 12th, and it will be the Titanic's very first full day at sea.
It is now April 12, 1912, the RMS Titanic's first full day at sea. She's cruising along, making good progress, traveling at a speed of right around 21 knots, or roughly 20 to 25 miles per hour, somewhere in that ballpark, which is really impressive considering that the Titanic was actually designed to go at this speed. But what many people don't know, and this is big proof that the Titanic wasn't going for any kind of speed record, is that not all of the boiler rooms were lit. You see, the Titanic had 6 boiler rooms, and only boiler rooms 6 through 2 were actually lit up throughout the voyage. Boiler room 1 was never turned on, period, not even during the sinking. So that's quite impressive that the Titanic is traveling at near cruising speed or maximum speed with only 5 of its 6 boiler rooms lit up. So that is proof right there that the Titanic was not going for any kind of speed record.
The most notable event from this day on board the Titanic came in the form of an ice warning. You see, on this day, the Titanic received its first ice warning from a steamship called the Lotterin, but it wasn't an official ice warning. You see, most of the message was just to the captain, congratulating him on his new command, wishing the Titanic luck on its maiden voyage, and it was more like, by the way, we passed some ice. So even though it was an ice warning, it wasn't an official ice warning. Just think of it like, by the way, we encountered some ice.
Captain Smith sent a message back to that ship thanking them for the information, and he made an official note of where the ice was. And yeah, that was pretty much it for that message. So Captain Smith did send a message back to that other ship thanking them for their letter, and he also made a note of where that ice was so the Titanic would be prepared for it. But yeah, the rest of the day pretty much went without incident. One semi-amusing thing did happen. Thomas Andrews got a little bit homesick. So everybody's favorite baker, Charles Yawkins, we all know who he is now, he actually made Thomas Andrews some bread just to help him feel a little bit better. But yeah, besides that, there was a dinner party in the restaurant. Bruce Ismay had some friends over to his stateroom, and yeah, pretty much the rest of the day went without incident. And that is what happened on April 12, 1912, on board the RMS Titanic.
April 13th, 1912. This is one of the most eventful sea days that occurs on board the RMS Titanic.
April 13th, 1912 was definitely a very eventful day on board the RMS Titanic. The first thing of note is actually that the Titanic was making extremely good time. She actually covered a little bit more distance on this day than she did the day before. She was actually covering so much distance that the people on board the ship, both the crew and the passengers, thought the Titanic might arrive in New York a day early. But now, when I say arrive in New York a day early, I don't mean that the ship would pull up to the pier and the passengers would get off. Essentially what they did was they had what's called a light ship. There was a light ship in Southampton and a light ship in New York. And when the vessel passes that ship in both places, that's when the voyage is either counted as complete or starting and complete. Past the light ship in Southampton, voyage starts. Past the light ship in New York, voyage ends. So they were talking that they might actually arrive in New York a day early, which is crazy considering that they hadn't lit all of the Titanic's boiler rooms at this point.
Another key event happened on board the RMS Titanic today. You see, ever since the Titanic had left Southampton, there had been a small coal fire burning in the starboard coal bunker of boiler room number 6. So they had been working to put out this coal fire since the Titanic left Southampton. And what they had to do to put this fire out was they moved all of the coal from the starboard coal bunker, dousing the fire as they went, and put it into the port side coal bunker.
It's important for you guys to understand just how big of a deal it was for them to put out that coal fire on the Titanic. We're talking about them moving hundreds of tons worth of coal. And they had moved so much coal from the starboard side of the Titanic to the port side of the Titanic to put out this fire, that it had a noticeable effect on the trim of the Titanic. So as the Titanic was sailing along, as soon as they put out that coal fire, the Titanic was actually listing about 3 degrees to port due to all that extra weight of the coal that was now moved from the starboard to the port side. Think of it kind of like when you fly an airplane, you have to make sure that all the weight is balanced on the plane so you have a more stable flight. It was a similar concept to this. They had moved so much coal that the Titanic was now off-centered, so it was sailing with this 3-degree list to port.
This 3-degree list to port would also have another impact inside the Titanic's grand staircase. You see, on this day, there was a first-class passenger and she was walking down these stairs, but the flooring of the grand staircase was made of this linoleum tile, and it had just been recently mopped, so the floor was actually really wet. So as she was walking down these stairs, she was thrown off balance by the 3-degree list, and due to the fact that this floor was wet, so what happened? She fell down the stairs and broke her arm. But she was quickly taken to the ship's doctor, who patched her up, and she was able to go to dinner that night, so there were no lasting effects to this little tumble down the stairs.
There would be one more big event on board the RMS Titanic today. You see, as the Titanic was sailing along, a lot of the passengers were sending private messages home via the Marconi wireless system. Sending messages to their friends, their family, telling them how the voyage was going, etc., etc. And Jack Phillips and Harold Bright had a lot of messages that they were going through. But as they were doing their job, sending these messages, the Marconi wireless machine broke. Now, according to the manual, if your Marconi wireless system breaks while you're on a ship and en route, do not try to fix it. Switch over to the emergency system. And they could have done this, however, the emergency system does not have anywhere near the range of the main Marconi wireless. The emergency system can go about 50 miles, whereas the main Marconi wireless can go around 300 miles. Sometimes you can even push that to 1,000 miles given the right atmospheric conditions. So, anyway, they decided to go ahead and try to fix the Marconi wireless, even though they were expressly forbidden from doing so. In the Marconi wireless manual, do not try to fix it, period. That's just how it goes. But they worked long into the night and into the early mornings of April 14th, and they did actually manage to fix the Marconi wireless. And if they hadn't have done that, that would have had serious repercussions on the night of April 14th/15th when the Titanic had struck the iceberg.
It is Sunday, April 14th, 1912, and the Titanic is still making very good time. Where it's Sunday morning, there are church services happening all throughout the ship, and things are proceeding pretty normally on board the Titanic as the morning progresses.
Now, on Sunday morning, this is also the time that a lifeboat drill was scheduled to be commenced on board the Titanic. However, the Titanic was making such good time and the engines were really being efficient right now that the crew on board did not want to stop the engines lower a lifeboat to do a drill, and then turn the engines back on again. They had already had a lifeboat drill while the Titanic was in Southampton, and it went without incident, so they didn't really see the need to do it again.
The Titanic's Marconi wireless system was brought back online around 4 or 5 a.m. on the morning of the 14th, so Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were also hard at work dealing with all the backlog of passenger messages that had been accumulating while the wireless system was offline.
Now, on the 14th of April, this was the day that the Titanic received the most ice warnings throughout the entire voyage. I think somewhere around 6 ice warnings were received on the ship. Now, most of these ice warnings had 2 things in common. Number 1 was that they reported that there was ice around, but number 2, they said that the visibility and the conditions around the ice was perfectly clear. So what the crew on board the Titanic was thinking is, sure, there's icebergs ahead, but we have perfect visibility. There's no problem. We'll see these icebergs long before they're any threat to the Titanic. So this was kind of the mindset at the time. And Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the 2 wireless operators on the Titanic, were even more busy because they were still continuing to try to deal with all the backlog of messages that had been accumulating from the day before when the Marconi wireless was offline.
On the evening of April the 14th, Captain Smith went to the bridge and talked to Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who was still on duty in the early part of the evening, and asked him what the conditions were on board the Titanic. And Lightoller said the conditions are still clear and calm. So from their perspective, even though they knew there was ice in the area, the conditions on board the Titanic and the visibility was perfect. So at this point, they still didn't see any need to slow the Titanic down. If there was any icebergs ahead, we would see it long before it would be any risk to the Titanic.
Right after the captain and Second Officer Charles Lightoller had this conversation, the captain did tell Lightoller that he was going to go back to his cabin to get some rest, but to keep a sharp eye on the conditions around the Titanic, and if anything was to change, they were to wake him and let him know as soon as possible. Second Officer Charles Lightoller agreed, and then the captain went back to his room. Now, not too long after this happened, Lightoller also went off duty, and First Officer William Murdoch went on duty. Lightoller told Murdoch the captain's instructions, Murdoch agreed, and then Lightoller also retired to his cabin for the night. Now, at this point, the Titanic is still cruising along, sailing at around 21, 22 knots, and back in the Titanic's Marconi wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride are also hard at work, still working on the huge backlog of messages from the passengers. Now, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, they're communicating with a place called Cape Race, which is really far away from the Titanic. And the way Marconi technology worked is the further away a place is, the louder you have to turn the volume up on your headset in order to hear the faint dots and dashes of the Morse code. So while they're doing this, they're relaying the passengers' messages to Cape Race, who will then relay it to wherever else they need to go. Another steamship called the Californian tries to message the Titanic, and the Californian is really close to the Titanic. But because the Titanic's radio was turned up so high, when the Californian messaged it in, it came through as a sharp ring in Jack Phillips' ears. And he got so irritated, he just ripped his headset off, slammed it on the ground, and then sent an angry message to the Californian. Keep out, shut up, I'm busy, I'm talking to Cape Race. Now, a lot of people like to fault Jack Phillips for this, but what you have to remember is he had been up for probably a little over 40 hours at this point. He was up all night working fixing the wireless machine. He was up all day sending these passengers messages. He was extremely tired. And then on top of that, he just got a loud ring in his ears. I can understand why he would get mad. Wouldn't anybody else? I mean, what he did wasn't right. Don't take what I'm saying out of context. But all I'm saying is, I get why it happened.
The ship you see in this picture is the SS Californian, the ship that Jack Phillips on board the Titanic just cut off. Now, what Jack Phillips didn't realize is that in the message that the Californian was trying to send to the Titanic was the Californian was trying to warn the Titanic that they were stuck in a massive ice field, and that the Californian decided to stop for the evening. And they were just trying to relay that message to the Titanic before Jack Phillips rudely brushed off the ship. Now, right after this, the Californian's wireless operator decided to go to bed for the evening. And when he did that, he was the only wireless operator on board the Californian. So when he switched off the radio, he essentially cut ties to the Titanic, and the Titanic lost contact with the closest ship to her while the Titanic was steaming rapidly into an ice field.
It is currently 11:37 p.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and the Titanic is still sailing along at 21, 22 knots. In the Titanic's crow's nest at the very front of the ship, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee are looking way out into the dark to try to spot any icebergs or any threats to the Titanic. And then on the Titanic's bridge, First Officer William Murdoch is also on duty, and he is also trying to look out into the dark to spot any icebergs or any threats to the Titanic. As the minutes tick by, as we come up on 11:40 p.m., First Officer William Murdoch suddenly hears 3 sharp clangs on the crow's nest bell.
It is Sunday, April 14, 1912, 11:39 p.m. RMS Titanic is cruising along at 21-22 knots with First Officer William Murdoch on duty on the bridge, and in the crow's nest high above the Titanic is Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. All 3 men are doing their duty on the Titanic this night, keeping an eye out for icebergs and doing everything they can to ensure a safe passage on the RMS Titanic.
A lot of people like to fault the RMS Titanic's crew for going into a known ice field at this speed, but you have to remember, even though they knew there was ice in the area, the conditions that night looked perfectly clear. So as far as the crew was concerned, any icebergs that would be a threat to the Titanic, they thought they could see it long before it would be any danger to the ship. However, what the crew did not realize is that there was a mirage effect going on that night, obscuring their view. So that meant that due to this mirage effect, they would not see any danger until it was literally right up in front of the Titanic.
This picture does a great job in showcasing how the iceberg was hidden by this mirage effect that was in the area the Titanic was sailing that night. You see, the mirage effect generated what's called a false horizon. So anybody on board the Titanic, when they're looking straight ahead out into the night, they would only see this false horizon. Nothing below this would be visible on board the Titanic until they were right up on it. And this iceberg was completely inside this false horizon layer, meaning the crew on board the Titanic did not see the iceberg until it was literally too late for them to act.
Now you might be thinking right now, how did the Titanic's crew miss this mirage effect that was going on? Wouldn't it create some weird lighting effects and stuff? Or was this effect completely unknown to sailors in the days of Titanic? Well, no. Sailors knew about mirage effects at sea. They were a thing that happened. But you see, the night the Titanic went down, it was a very odd night. Typically, the way you spot a mirage is due to other sources of light, like whether it be the sun, the moon. That light can help you identify the strange effects of a mirage. But the night the Titanic struck the iceberg, there was no moon, so that meant it was very dark and hard to spot any weird lighting effects. And the ocean was dead calm. So even though there were signs of a mirage, the crew on the Titanic couldn't really spot it because there was no other source of light to help them identify the weird atmospheric traits that occur when you have a mirage effect like what happened the night the Titanic sank.
At 11:39 p.m. and 30 seconds, the RMS Titanic's crew finally spots the iceberg, but by then it is way too late. But William Murdoch, the officer on duty, has to try to do something, so he orders the engines to stop, and he orders the Titanic to turn hard to starboard, which, due to tiller commands, means turn the Titanic to port. And believe it or not, the Titanic is very maneuverable, and it does look like, at least for a time, that the Titanic may turn and miss the iceberg, but just barely.
But as we all know, most of an iceberg's mass isn't above the surface, it's below the waterline. So even though it appeared on the Titanic that they were going to miss the iceberg, but just barely, they were still in fact heading for an impact. However, it would be parts of the iceberg that are underneath the water that would end up striking the Titanic. Not that much above the waterline would end up damaging the ship.
At exactly 11:40 p.m., RMS Titanic struck the iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline, damaging 5 of her 16 watertight compartments severely and slightly compromising a 6th compartment, a small tear of just 3 feet in a coal bunker of boiler room number 5, which was the 6th compartment on board Titanic.
Right after the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg, First Officer William Murdoch ordered all of the Titanic's watertight doors to be closed, and all the doors did close successfully. And at least for a time, it seems like they did avoid catastrophe on board the Titanic. Even though they did hit the berg and they felt the vibrations, I mean, it was an impact, it does seem like they avoided the worst case scenario. The Titanic did just, in fact, graze the iceberg. You know, they hit it, but it just kind of went along the hull and the Titanic kept on going. So they believed at the time that with all the Titanic's safety features, the watertight bulkheads, the watertight doors, that it was a close call, but it seems like that they did avoid catastrophe, at least for the moment.
However, with 6 watertight compartments compromised on board the Titanic, there was no way the Titanic could stay afloat indefinitely. You see, the biggest problem with the watertight bulkheads, highlighted in red in this diagram, is that they don't go all the way up to the boat deck. They only go up to about E deck. So that meant that as the Titanic slowly started to sink, the water would be able to spill over the tops of the bulkheads and travel back and back into the next compartment. So the lower the Titanic's bow gets, the further the water can progress inside the ship.
Now you're probably wondering, what do you mean the tops of the watertight bulkheads weren't sealed? How could that possibly prevent the Titanic from sinking with any damage? Well, the way it worked was with the 16 watertight compartments, the Titanic could handle any 2 compartments compromised. So compartment here could be compromised and the ship would float. Or the first 4 watertight compartments at the front of the ship could be compromised and the Titanic could still float. You see, the way that they designed these watertight bulkheads was that if 4 watertight compartments were breached, the water would fill up to the tops of the bulkheads, the bow of the Titanic would sink down so low, but the bow would not go down low enough for the water to be able to spill over the tops of the bulkheads. So they're like, going up to E deck, 4 compartments breached, this is fine. You know, having 4 watertight compartments compromised is a pretty serious impact. So they didn't think that could happen. However, with 6 watertight compartments compromised, the RMS Titanic's bow would sink down so low that the water would be able to flow over the tops of the bulkheads. So that's essentially what happened to the Titanic. They thought that 4 watertight compartments would be the worst case scenario. They never dreamed when they were building this ship that 6 compartments could be compromised, like what really happened to the Titanic the night she sank.
At 11:45 p.m., the RMS Titanic finally drifted to a halt. They chose to just let the Titanic drift to a stop instead of reversing the engines. So at this point, Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews would have already made their way to the bridge and then begun to figure out how to carry out the damage inspection. So at this point, the officers would be learning where they were going to be sent, and they would begin trying to figure out exactly how much damage had been inflicted on the Titanic by the iceberg impact.
At 11:50 p.m., roughly 10 minutes after the Titanic had struck the iceberg, one of the higher-up officers made a decision that it would be okay for the Titanic to continue on and re-engage the ship's engines for a time while the damage inspections were carried out. Remember, they had no way of knowing the full extent of the damage yet. They had no way of knowing how catastrophic the damage on Titanic was. They still thought that this was just a side scrape, you know, not that big a deal. Maybe a couple of compartments are flooded. So while they still had this mindset, they didn't see anything wrong with having the ship continue on at a lower speed while damage inspections were carried out.
However, one big reason for the crew's confusion about the actual condition of Titanic in the early stages of the sinking was due to the fact that the first 4 compartments of the Titanic that were compromised by the iceberg, they essentially had no personnel in them. They were essentially just cargo holds and stuff. So there was no one in there to know how bad the damage was immediately after the impact. The only room at the front of the ship that was badly damaged that had crew was boiler room number 6. You can see it perfectly in this diagram. In this diagram, the green lines you see represent the iceberg damage, where the red lines represent watertight bulkheads. So as you can tell, the crew only immediately knew about the flooding in Boiler Room 6. They had no way to know how bad the damage was in the first 4 compartments until sometime later.
Now, what I'm about to tell you is partially speculation. I have no way to verify any of this. I'm just telling you my theories based on evidence that I've seen and some speculation as to some of these events. So here's what's really happening. There is no exact time frame as to when the crew in Boiler Room 6 were forced to abandon that area. But due to some testimony of survivors, it appears that they remained in Boiler Room 6 for about 15 to 20 minutes after the iceberg impact, despite it being damaged so severely. And I'm curious as to if they were actually trying to pump out the water in Boiler Room number 6. You see, Boiler Room 6 was the only compartment at the very front of the Titanic that actually had a pump. None of the forward sections in the cargo holds did, and the rest of Titanic's pumps were located towards the back sections of the ship. They'd have to run hoses from there up to the front in order to deal with water. So, if they were in that room about 20 minutes after the iceberg impact, then that means they would have been in there when they re-engaged the Titanic's engines. Now, I've never seen any evidence that they actually turned on the pump in Boiler Room 6, but if they did remain in there for a while, then it's quite possible that they might have. So, as I said, this is just speculation, but when they re-engaged the Titanic's engines and the ship continued on, that put more pressure on the damaged sections of Titanic's hull, thus increasing the amount of flooding that was going on inside that compartment. So, the Titanic's engines actually reactivated for about 10 minutes after the iceberg impact. So that kind of goes along with the whole 20-minute time frame that the crew in Boiler Room number 6 said when they were forced to abandon that room. So if they were trying to hold back the water in boiler room number 6, then the forward momentum of Titanic only increased the water flow in that compartment, thus overwhelming the crew and forcing them to abandon it. If they hadn't re-engaged the engines, maybe the crew could have lasted in boiler room 6 a little bit longer, but this is highly debatable, and this is just a theory based on evidence that I've seen and some information that I know about the Titanic.
At 11:56 p.m., the crew on board the Titanic, having realized the seriousness of the situation and how badly damaged the Titanic is, the Titanic's engines are ordered to stop for one final time. This would be the last time the Titanic's engines would function, and the Titanic would then at this point slowly drift to a halt. The crew that was now inside of boiler room 6 has now retreated back into boiler room number 5 to attempt to delay the water from proceeding any further inside the Titanic.
Right around midnight, after the Titanic finally drifted to a halt, the full scale of the evacuation was now put into effect. They started waking up the passengers, started getting lifeboats ready. This would have been the time the Titanic would have been about to send out its first distress call. So there's a lot of things going on. So think of it like this, from 12 a.m. to 12:15 a.m., this is when the real work on board the RMS Titanic began. And this is when the full scale of the evacuation and what exactly was going to happen to this ship was finally starting to sink in on the Titanic's crew.
Now, while the crew on board the Titanic was working to get the lifeboats ready, get the passengers woken up, etc., another problem came upon the crew on the Titanic. You see, right around this time, they started to vent out the steam on the Titanic through the funnels. You see, at the time that the Titanic struck the iceberg, it had essentially been operating under a full load of steam. And when the ship stopped, they had to get rid of all of this excess steam before a pressure burst the tank and potentially could cause some boilers to explode. So at this point, all the excess steam inside the Titanic started to vent out through the ship's massive funnels, and it was so loud that the officers on the bridge on the deck trying to get the lifeboats ready could not communicate with each other unless they were screaming at the top of their lungs, and the person they were talking to was standing right beside them.
Honestly, just try to think about how difficult that must have been for the crew of Titanic to try to get the evacuation underway, keep everything organized, keep everything running smoothly, while the steam is roaring out of these massive funnels. I mean, just imagine being around a sound that is so loud that you can barely hear yourself think. On top of that, you're trying to stay organized. I mean, honestly, as far as I'm concerned, the Titanic's crew should get a lot of praise for operating as well as they did under those circumstances. Okay, so now we're going to jump ahead to between 12:15 a.m. and 12:30 a.m. At this point, the Titanic had been broadcasting a distress signal for a little bit of time now. The first lifeboat is about ready to be lowered. There's passengers coming up on deck. The evacuation is well underway at this point.
Around 12:15 a.m., the RMS Carpathia, which at this point is roughly 50 to 60 miles away from Titanic, is sailing along, and its wireless operator, whose name was Harold Cottam, had already signed off for the evening. So at this point, even though the Titanic was broadcasting a distress signal, the crew on board the Carpathia did not know about it yet. But then a miracle did happen on board the Carpathia. You see, Harold Cottam was about to go to bed for the night, but just like Jack Phillips and Harold Brad on Titanic, he was a little bit of a tech nerd, and he liked using the tech, he liked listening to messages, he liked to know what was going on. So he decided to turn on the radio just for a minute to see what was up, and he heard the Titanic's distress call and responded immediately. He sent a message to Titanic, what's going on, what's the situation, and Jack Phillips on the Titanic responded, come at once, we're sinking. So at this point, Harold Cottam responded and wrote a message immediately back to the Titanic telling them that they're on their way and rushed to give the message that the Titanic is sinking to the captain of the Carpathia.
Just think about how lucky it was that Harold Cottam was just so happened to turn the radio back on and hear the Titanic's distress call. If he hadn't have done that, the Carpathia would have been just like the Californian, a close ship that could help the Titanic, but with the radio off, they wouldn't know what was going on. But now, if you would think that was the end of the Carpathia's story, you're wrong. You see, when Harold got up on the bridge and told the bridge crew that the Titanic was sinking, they laughed at him. They're like, the Titanic's not sinking. Someone's pulling a joke on you. Essentially, what the crew on the bridge of the Carpathia was referring to is, as wireless technology was getting more common in the early 1900s, people were actually sending out fake distress calls pretending to be other ships. So you know how we have trolls on the internet now that always send out fake messages or try to mess with people? Well, essentially people were doing that 100 years ago at the time of Titanic with wireless technology. I mean, seriously, it is just the craziest thing ever that people 100 years ago were doing the exact same thing that people today do.
Now, the captain on board the Carpathia had already retired for the evening, and upon seeing that the crew on the Carpathia weren't going to help him, Harold decided to go and bust into the captain's room while he's asleep and tell him that the Titanic is sinking. Now, at first, the captain of the Carpathia was furious. He's like, "What are you doing? Why'd you break into my cabin? Don't you know I'm the captain? You're supposed to treat me with respect." But once Harold told him that the Titanic was sinking, the captain of the Carpathia wasted no time to respond. He immediately calmed down, immediately got dressed, and told them to turn the ship around and start heading for the Titanic as soon as possible.
Now, unfortunately, the RMS Carpathia only had a speed of around 17 knots, and with it being 50 to 60 miles away from the Titanic, that means that the Carpathia will need around 4 hours to reach the Titanic's position, meaning it will not arrive in time to actually help the ship before she goes down. But besides that, the captain of the Carpathia is running full steam ahead and trying to get to the Titanic as quickly as possible. So now we're going to jump ahead, we're going to jump back to Titanic, and now we're going to talk about the time frame between 12:30 and 12:45 a.m. on the Titanic. And this is a very eventful time as far as key events that occur on the Titanic during the sinking.
Around 12:30 a.m., a mystery ship is spotted on the horizon, roughly 10 miles or so from the RMS Titanic. Now, this ship isn't responding to the distress call of the Titanic, so the crew on board think that this ship is essentially an older steamer that doesn't have wireless. Maybe the wireless is off, they don't know. So at this point, they decide to start launching distress rockets, although it would be another 10-15 minutes before the first one goes up. And they also decide to try to signal the ship with a Morse lamp. A Morse lamp is essentially a giant flashlight that they use to signal other ships with Morse code on ships that don't have a Marconi wireless system on board.
Now I'm going to jump ahead to 12:40 a.m. on the Titanic. 12:40 a.m. is a very eventful time on the Titanic. Two big things did happen during this period. Number one, this is also the time the very first lifeboat left the Titanic. Now I'm going to go into more detail about that in a second, but first I want to talk about something else. The second thing that occurred at this time was in boiler room number 5, deep inside the Titanic, essentially the front line where the crew inside of the ship is trying to hold back the water. So, just for your knowledge, in boiler room number 5, the Iceberg did, in fact, breach this compartment. This is the 6th compartment on the Titanic, right around pretty much after the first funnel. So, essentially, the Iceberg put a small 3-foot hole inside of the coal bunker of boiler room number 5. Now, just to clarify, the coal bunker is past the watertight bulkhead. The watertight bulkhead itself wasn't damaged. So that meant the water was flooding inside of a coal bunker. So the crew in boiler room number 5 did secure this coal bunker. They shut it up, they secured it, they made it as watertight as possible. However, the room that holds this coal is only held together by a thin sheet of metal. It's not designed to be watertight. So even though the crew did keep boiler room 5 from flooding for a time, around 12:40 a.m. is when this thin sheet of metal, this basic little room designed to hold coal, could not hold back the pressure of the water that was flooding into it anymore, and the whole wall of the coal bunker collapsed, rapidly flooding boiler room number 5.
There's a clip from a Titanic documentary called What Sank the Titanic that showcases perfectly what it would have been like for the men inside of Boiler Room 5 when they were forced to evacuate this room. So I'm going to show you this clip, leave it completely intact, audio and everything, just so you get an idea of what it would have been like for the men in Boiler Room 5 when the coal bunker wall gave way.
The pressure makes the very metal begin to scream.
That is an absolutely unbelievable shot, and it perfectly showcases what it would have been like in Boiler Room 5 right as soon as that coal bunker wall gave way. And believe it or not, we do have a survivor from there. His name was Frederick Barrett, and he would actually, in fact, make it to a lifeboat. He was actually in Boiler Room 6 right as soon as Titanic hit the iceberg and saw the hull of Titanic open up. And then he moved back into Boiler Room 5 and was in there when the coal bunker wall collapsed, and yet he still made it to a lifeboat. He's got one of the most crazy survival stories from the Titanic, and I am going to make a dedicated video about him at some point. Alright, so now let's jump back up to the boat deck and get to the lifeboats. So the two officers that were put in charge of the lifeboats was First Officer William Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Now, First Officer William Murdoch was put in charge of the lifeboats on the starboard side of the Titanic, or the right side, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller was put in charge of the lifeboats on the port side. Now, both of these officers were given the order, women and children first, but each of them would interpret these orders differently. First Officer William Murdoch took it as what it says, women and children first. Second Officer Charles Lightoller took it as women and children only. Now, these actions by these officers would have serious consequences during the sinking. First Officer William Murdoch's evacuation went a lot more smoothly than Second Officer Lightoller because he was more flexible about the whole women and children first thing. And Second Officer Charles Lightoller was just like, if you're not a woman or a child, you're not getting on the boat, period. So this caused a lot of situations on his side of the ship because families did not want to be separated in the course of the evacuation.
Now, even with this confusion among the officers on exactly what the captain's orders on the women and children first with the lifeboats meant, they still did succeed in getting all the lifeboats off the Titanic in a fairly efficient manner without any lifeboats being lost. And that's a big thing to say considering you're on a sinking ship and you need to evacuate 2,200 people. There were some pretty major incidents with the lifeboats throughout the course of the evacuation where these lifeboats were almost lost, including its occupants, but this didn't happen. All the lifeboats on the Titanic were successfully launched, with the first one leaving the ship at 12:40 a.m., exactly 1 hour after the Titanic had struck the iceberg. When we last left the Titanic, it was approximately 12:40 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912. At this time period, the first lifeboat was preparing to be successfully lowered away from the RMS Titanic. This lifeboat, which had a capacity for 65 people, would unfortunately only have 28 souls on board when it left the Titanic.
So why was this the case? Why was it that in the beginning parts of the sinking, so few people were on board the initial lifeboats launched from the Titanic? Well, there were a lot of reasons for this, but number one was it had to do with the passengers didn't really even know what was going on. Shoot, some of the officers didn't even know what was going on at this point. Anyway, so most of the passengers on board the Titanic that had found their way up to the deck still believed that this was a drill. They didn't believe that the Titanic was actually sinking. And you might be wondering, how would they not know the ship is sinking? I mean, didn't they notice that the Titanic was really heavily listing by the bow, like the bow was lower in the water? Well, I'm sure some of them did notice, but that's what's funny about our minds. You get used to it very quick. So even if they did notice it at first, after some time, your body naturally adjusts. So the Titanic wasn't so far gone yet that people were actually alarmed. And on top of that, the crew is telling the passengers, it's just a drill, you'll be back on board for breakfast. And if anybody has ever been on a ship at night and you look out at the ocean looks freaky at night. I mean, it's just pitch black as far as the eye can see. No light, it's freezing cold. And on top of that, they're telling the women and children to get in this boat and leave your husbands behind, and it's just a drill. I mean, would you feel safe doing that? Why would you want to get into a rowboat in the middle of the North Atlantic on a freezing cold night when you've got this brilliantly lit, very warm, and nice Titanic just sitting there? I mean, I understand why so few people were hesitant to get into a lifeboat in the early stages of the sinking due to the fact that they didn't really even know what was going on.
This chart, which was taken from the amazing Titanic book On a Sea of Glass, shows the timestamps at which each lifeboat was actually able to leave the Titanic from the port side and the starboard side. So even though the crew did have some issues getting the lifeboats launched and filled up in the initial parts of the sinking, as you can see from this chart, they were quite efficient at getting the lifeboats away from the Titanic pretty efficiently, with about 2 lifeboats leaving the Titanic every 5 minutes or so. And of course, as the sinking progressed and people actually realized what was going on, these lifeboats would leave with a lot more people on them than it was in the initial parts of the sinking. Most of the issues with the crew and dealing with the lifeboats seems to have occurred during the early stages of the sinking, while people were still trying to figure out the scope of what was happening to the Titanic.
Now, just a quick disclaimer about this video. This video is not going to be an in-depth look at the launching of the Titanic's lifeboats. From 1240 up to the sinking, the lifeboats launch at such a rapid rate that I don't have time to actually go through and analyze each lifeboat launch and talk about a lot of the interesting information that can go along with them. And trust me, some of these lifeboats are very interesting. Right now, for this video, we're just going to be talking about the Titanic itself, the events around the sinking, and then I will make a dedicated video talking about the launching of the lifeboats and some key events that happen with those at another point.
We are coming up on 12:45 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and at this point 2 things happen. Number 1, the second lifeboat to leave the Titanic is successfully launched with 36 people on board, and number 2, the D-deck gangway door on the port side of the Titanic is opened up. Now, a gangway door is essentially used to actually load passengers onto a ship while a ship is at port, and Second Officer Charles Lightoller sends some men down to open this door, with the whole idea being to use them as another means to load passengers into the lifeboats. So essentially, you'd open the the door, the lifeboat would roll up to the door, you'd load passengers through it, etc., etc. However, this door was completely forgotten about throughout the course of the sinking, and it allowed a new way for the water to actually rapidly flood the Titanic once the Titanic sank to the point that water could actually reach this D-deck gangway door.
Now, in case you're wondering how it's possible that Lightoller could actually forget about this D-deck gangway door, let me give you the backstory so you'll understand the situation a little bit more. Essentially, what happened is Second Officer Charles Lightoller ordered a man to go down and open up that door for the reasons I said earlier, and then to report back to him once this task had been done. And Lightoller never saw the man again. Throughout the course of the evening, Lightoller never talked to this man to confirm whether or not the door had been opened or not. And he didn't even know if the door had been opened. There was a lot of debate among the Titanic community as to whether or not this door was in fact open that night. Now, here's where the evidence comes in that the door was most likely opened, as Lightoller said. When we went down to the wreck of the Titanic, the D-deck gangway door is still open and visible on the wreck to this day. Now, skeptics of this would probably say, oh, the door got blown open when the Titanic slammed into the seafloor. And sure, possible. But when you take into account all the information that Lightoller said, plus some key evidence that occurred as the Titanic continued to sink, if you want my opinion, I say it's about a 99% certainty that this D-deck gangway door was in fact open, like Second Officer Charles Lightoller said.
At 12:47 a.m., the RMS Titanic fires off its first distress rocket in an attempt to signal the mystery ship that is on the horizon. Now, as stated in part 1 of this series, about 20 minutes before this, a mysterious vessel was spotted roughly 10 miles or so away from the RMS Titanic. Now, this ship wasn't responding to the Titanic's distress calls over the Marconi wireless system, and it also wasn't responding to the Morse lamp. So at this point, the officers on board the Titanic were hoping that the distress rockets would be a way to get this vessel or this mystery vessel's attention and get them over to help rescue the people on the Titanic.
Now, there have been a lot of theories over the decades as to what the identity of this mystery vessel actually was. Some people believe it was a ship called the Mount Temple, which was around 50 miles or so away from the Titanic. Now, I don't think that was possible because at 50 miles, you wouldn't be able to see anything at that point. I'm under the impression that it was the steamship Californian. Now, a lot of people like to argue this case, but I'm about to show you some key evidence as to why I actually believe the Californian is the mystery ship that the Titanic was seeing that night.
The vessel seen in this picture is the rumored mystery ship that was visible on board the RMS Titanic the night she sank, the SS Californian. Now, why do I personally believe that this vessel was the mystery ship that was spotted on the Titanic that night? Well, it has to do with mostly evidence that was given out during the inquiries after the Titanic disaster. You see, the crew that were on board the Californian that night reported seeing a ship come up alongside them at around 11:40 p.m., and then mysteriously this vessel seemed to just stop. Now, that timestamp right there is proof to me because it coincides with the exact time that the RMS Titanic struck the iceberg. So the people in the Californian saw a ship pull up. At 11:40, this ship seemed to stop. That matches exactly with what happened on board the RMS Titanic after she struck the iceberg.
Now, before everybody in the comment section goes, wait a minute, if they said they saw a ship stop at 11:40, sure, that matches up with the Titanic, but we all know now that the Titanic actually continued on under her own power for a few minutes after the iceberg impact. Doesn't that counteract what they said they saw in the Californian? Well, most likely not, because the Titanic did not continue on under her own steam for that long post-iceberg impact, only around 5 or 10 minutes or so. So, and besides that, she wasn't even traveling that fast. So if there were any discrepancies in the location of the Titanic based on the views that the people had on the Californian, at being 10 miles away, it's highly unlikely that they would have noticed any noticeable progression of the ship in that short amount of time post-iceberg impact.
The second key piece of evidence that really makes me believe that the mystery ship seen that night by the Californian was the Titanic has to do with the fact that the crew on the Californian said that about an hour or so after observing this mystery vessel, the mystery ship started shooting off rockets. Now, at the time, the crew on the Californian was kind of confused as to what these rockets actually meant. But here are the two key things to take away from here. Number one, the crew on the Californian saw a ship pull up and stop around 11:40 p.m. Matches what happened with the Titanic exactly. Number two, about an hour or so after this ship stopped, the crew on the Californian said that they saw this mystery ship shooting off rockets. Again, that matches with what happened on the Titanic exactly. So in my opinion, this mystery vessel was the Californian that was seen by the Titanic the night she sank.
Now, even though we've established that it was most likely the Californian that was seen by the Titanic the night she went down, I don't blame the crew on board the Californian for being confused at what they were observing when they were watching the Titanic from so far away. And there's three key pieces of evidence to completely understand the picture between what was going on with the Titanic and the Californian the night she sank. Number one, the Californian did not answer the Titanic's distress call because the Marconi operator on board the Californian was asleep. They only had one operator on board the Californian who actually really knew what he was doing and could respond to distress calls, and he had already gone to bed for the night, so the Californian couldn't hear the Titanic. Number two, the crew on the Californian did attempt to contact the Titanic by using a Morse lamp, just like what the Titanic tried to do to the Californian. However, due to the weird atmospheric conditions that night, it caused the light of the Morse lamp to be obscured. So the crew on both ships thought they were seeing the dots and dashes of Morse code. They weren't really sure. So they thought maybe it was just a flickering mast light. Like they didn't really know what was going on due to the weird weather effects that night. And number three, when the Titanic was shooting off rockets, they were not shooting off rockets correctly based on what the law said you do to fire rockets for distress at sea. You see, rockets could also mean company signals, which is what the Californian crew thought they were seeing when the Titanic started shooting off rockets. In order for a rocket to be launched at sea and have it mean distress, you have to shoot off rockets in 1-minute intervals. Now, in the case of Titanic, it was shooting off rockets in 5-minute intervals. So I really don't blame the crew of the Californian for being confused at what they were observing the night the Titanic went down.
Now, the crew on board the Californian had been reporting to their captain about the exchanges between this mystery ship that they were observing. Now, the captain of the Californian had actually went to bed not long after they began observing this mystery ship on the horizon. Now, the crew on the Californian were sending updates to the captain as to the behavior of this mystery ship, including the fact that the ship had stopped, this ship was shooting off rockets, but the captain of the Californian basically thought what I just said. He thought the rockets were company signals. So he told the crew of the Californian to try to contact this mystery ship with the Morse lamp, which is what I was talking about earlier.
Now, here's my opinion on this whole situation with the Californian. I don't give them as hard of a time as a lot of people do. You see, in my opinion, the crew of the Californian is only guilty of one thing. They didn't put the whole situation together. They didn't really understand what they were observing. It's not like the crew of the Californian said, oh, the Titanic is sinking and we're not going to help. No, it wasn't like that at all. The crew of the Californian just didn't know what they were looking at. But to me, if I would have been on the Californian that night and I would have seen a weird ship or like a ship acting weird on the horizon, you know, think about it. You have a ship, it's cruising along, it's getting close to an ice field, then it stops, and then you see it start shooting off rockets. Sure, they're inconsistent and they don't match what the maritime regulation is for distress, but still, it's shooting off rockets in the middle of the Atlantic. We think we see the behavior of a Morse lamp, we're not really sure. To me, that's enough of a reason to go wake up the wireless guy. You know, go wake up the wireless guy, go see what's going on. That is what I think the crew of the Californian is guilty of. They just didn't put the whole situation together, and they just didn't do enough the night that the RMS Titanic went down.
It is now 12:50 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912, on board RMS Titanic, and the evacuation of this ship is well underway. Several lifeboats are already in the water, a good number of passengers are up on the boat deck, and the evacuation is starting to proceed rather smoothly despite the hiccups that the crew was facing earlier. However, deep inside the Titanic, this is a turning point in which the sinking begins to accelerate. You see, with the loss of Boiler Room 5 around 10 minutes before, this allows the water to rapidly start progressing through the Titanic without as much interference from the crew. Once the crew lost Boiler Room 5, this was a key turning point in the sinking of the RMS Titanic.
Even though Titanic was doomed with the loss of Boiler Room 6, Boiler Room 5 really did become the front line, so to speak, in the entire sinking of the RMS Titanic. That's where the crew tried to really mobilize, that's where they got together with their pumps, and their whole thinking was if they could hold back the water in Boiler Room 5 for as long as possible, then they could try to keep the water contained to the front sections of the ship, at least for a time. But when the crew lost Boiler Room 5 and they were forced to evacuate, the water pretty much had a free rein on the ship at that point. Sure, the crew would do things to actually delay the sinking a little bit more throughout the course of the evening, but Boiler Room 5 really was the front line for the crew on board the RMS Titanic that night. And when they had to evacuate that room, that really did signal the end for the RMS Titanic.
It is currently 12:50 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912, on board the RMS Titanic. At this point, the evacuation of the Titanic is well underway. There's a large number of passengers up on the boat deck, and more people are working their way out of the interior sections of the ship and trying to get up to the lifeboats. So at this point, the evacuation, while it had some hiccups at the beginning, is moving pretty efficiently at this point. However, deep inside the RMS Titanic, the flooding of the ship itself is beginning to rapidly accelerate. At this point in the sinking, the water is now beginning to access sections of the Titanic that would be normally occupied by passengers. You see, in the early stages of the sinking of the Titanic, with the exception of some people in third class, the flooding was mostly contained to sections of the ship that was only occupied by the Titanic's crew. Now, at this point in the sinking, 12:50 a.m. was essentially kind of like the midpoint for the disaster. The water is now beginning to access sections of the ship that the passengers of the Titanic would normally occupy. So at this point, passengers that were still inside the Titanic could notice the flooding and would know that something was seriously wrong with the Titanic.
Can you just imagine how terrifying that must have been for anybody still inside the Titanic to look out their window or their porthole window and just see the water slowly starting to climb outside? I mean, I honestly can't imagine how terrifying that would be. Now, when it came to actually organizing the evacuation, you see, the Titanic stateroom cabins, they had the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the way I understand it is they had a master lock, a lock that only the stateroom attendants could also access. So essentially, if the stateroom attendants wanted to, they could lock the cabin doors, and it would be a special lock that a regular passenger on the Titanic's key couldn't open. So once they locked this door, that door will be locked permanently. And the captain of the RMS Titanic actually ordered the stateroom attendants to go back to the decks that had been evacuated and lock the stateroom doors to prevent passengers from working their way back down and getting into these cabins. There was actually one of Titanic's passengers, I heard about this in A Night to Remember, that tried to go back into her room, and when the stateroom attendant came to lock her cabin, he almost locked her inside. It's like she heard the click of the lock and she screamed, and the stateroom attendant came back and got her. I mean, seriously, can you imagine being locked in your own stateroom in a rapidly sinking vessel? I mean, honestly, I bet that was a terrifying encounter for that passenger.
But for the crew of the RMS Titanic that was still within the ship's interior trying to get the last of the passengers up on deck, they were beginning to face another danger. You see, at around 1 a.m., the bow of the RMS Titanic was so low in the water that the water was now able to find its ways into ventilation ducts, the Titanic's pipes, the plumbing system, etc., etc. So now at this point, the water isn't just contained to the front sections of the ship that are flooding. The water is now finding new ways to access even further aspects of the Titanic. Imagine you were walking down one of these hallways and the water was flowing through a ventilation duct above you. That means you would see all the lights burn out in that hallway one by one as the water reached that section of the vent. I honestly can't imagine what a horrifying sight that would be if you were inside one of these hallways when this was happening.
Mental note after seeing that last clip. Get out of a ship's interior if you're ever on board a sinking vessel. Don't hang out in the inside spots because you may find yourself stuck in a place you don't want to be at a certain point in the sinking. And you know it only got worse as the sinking progressed. You see, as the Titanic's bow went further and further into the water, once the water began to spill over the tops of the watertight bulkheads, you may find yourself in a room or a section of the Titanic where the water is pouring down on you from above, and it's coming down at such a rapid rate that it's impossible for you to try to climb up it and get to the upper decks. So yeah, if you ever have a time machine and you go back in time and you're on board the Titanic when it's sinking, don't hang out in the interior sections of the ship. Get up on deck as quickly as possible.
We are now coming up on 1:10 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and as you can clearly see in this beautiful animation by Titanic Honor and Glory, the D-deck gangway door, which is clearly visible, is about ready to touch the water. It's amazing how far down the Titanic has went in the time since I first mentioned the door around 12:50 a.m. to just 20 minutes later at 1:10 a.m. And once this door finally reaches the water, the sinking of the Titanic is only going to accelerate. But for now, let's take a break from talking about what's going on inside the Titanic and jump up to the boat deck and discuss what's been going on with the lifeboats. More specifically, I want to talk about the captain's orders when he was telling the officers to begin evacuating the Titanic. More specifically, the order I want to discuss is the order women and children first when it comes to loading the lifeboats.
Not long after the Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews declared that the Titanic was sinking and that they needed to evacuate, Captain Smith told all the officers of the Titanic to begin to evacuate the ship, but he gave one order in particular that we're going to be discussing. The order was women and children first, and he was referring to who to evacuate from the Titanic's lifeboats due to the fact that the Titanic did not have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. Now, there were two officers that were primarily in charge with the evacuation and the lowering of the lifeboats. First Officer William Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Lightoller. First Officer William Murdoch was in charge of the lifeboats on the Titanic's starboard side or right side. Second Officer Charles Lightoller was in charge of the lifeboats on the port side. But you see, these officers who heard this order from the captain, they interpreted the orders differently based on what you might expect.
The man you see in this photograph is First Officer William Murdoch, and he interpreted the captain's orders, women and children first, as just that, women and children first, but if there were no women and children around and there were still seats in the lifeboats, he wouldn't care to let men escape the Titanic in that lifeboat. However, the man you see in this photograph, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, he interpreted the captain's orders as women and children only. So that means that throughout the sinking, he refused to let any men board any lifeboats, period. I believe there was only one male passenger that he ever let board a lifeboat, and that was due to the fact that he didn't have enough crew to man that lifeboat. But yeah, throughout the entire course of the sinking, Second Officer Charles Lightoller would not let any men board a lifeboat, even if there were empty seats available.
So, let me ask you guys a question. Who do you all think made the right call that night? Murdoch or Lightoller? If you're watching this video, after it's premiered, please leave your answer in the comments below. And if you're watching this video during the premiere, please leave your response in the live chat. I would love to see it because I will be watching. But if you want to know my opinion, I think Murdoch had it right. I mean, honestly, why send a lifeboat away if there are empty seats available? If a husband's there with his wife and kids and they get into a lifeboat and there's empty seats available, let the man get in the lifeboat. Let the man stay with his family. Don't separate families when you don't need to. I understand the whole mindset, women and children first, and I'm perfectly okay with it. You want to evacuate the women and children when you have a sinking ship and there aren't enough lifeboats. You want to save them. But if there are empty seats available, let some men get in the lifeboat. I mean, really, I don't think it's that hard. But when it comes to what Second Officer Charles Lightoller did, I think he just had this mindset that it's the honorable thing to do to stay behind. A man shouldn't get in a lifeboat. It's a coward tactic. A man should stay behind and let the women and children escape the lifeboat. That's what I think his mindset was, an honorable death, so to speak, I guess. I don't know. I mean, and I'm not just trying to completely hate on Lightoller here. He did do a lot, and he did save a lot of lives that night, including what happened to the people on collapsible Lifeboat B after the Titanic went down. His orders and actions saved people that night. And, and he did get the lifeboats away. But I just think he was kind of extreme on his whole policy around women and children first.
It is now 1:15 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and if you take a look over on the port side of the ship, you can see the D-deck gangway door beginning to dip beneath the surface. We will talk more about what's going on with that in the next episode. However, the last big thing that we are going to talk about in this video are the Titanic's two wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride.
Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were the two Marconi wireless operators on board the RMS Titanic. They were the ones who were in the Marconi room sending out the Titanic's distress call on the night of the sinking. Now, throughout the course of the evening, they were extremely busy from the moment when they started sending the Titanic's distress call to the moment where they abandoned their cabin. They basically didn't stop. Now, Jack Phillips was the one who was actually on the radio sending the distress call. Harold Bride was with him, but he was just kind of doing things in the office, going out on deck to see what was going on. He was kind of doing that stuff. Now, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had a very interesting perspective throughout the course of the sinking. You see, the way a Marconi wireless system works is you transmit a spark, and that spark is how you send the dots and dashes of Morse code. And the more power a ship has, the further range that dot and dash can go, as a signal. So throughout the course of the evening, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride noticed how the Titanic's power was faring throughout the course of the sinking. So at 12:50, they could talk to ships 300-400 miles away. And then at 1:15, they could talk to a ship 100 miles away. And then at 1:45, they could talk to a ship 50 miles away. So it's like they had a front view seat of the power on board the Titanic slowly diminishing over time. Most of the passengers on board the Titanic saw the power go out in a moment or in a flash right before the ship broke apart. But with Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, it was kind of like a very slow burnout. Like say, as my hands come in the center of my hands is where the Titanic was, and my hands out is the range of the signal. And they just saw the signal of the wireless closing in on them as the Titanic's power continued to diminish as the sinking of the Titanic progressed.
And another problem that Jack Phillips and Harold Bride had to contend with while the Titanic was sinking was just due to the fact that the people on other ships didn't really understand what was going on. You see, in the beginning parts of the sinking, Jack Phillips was having a hard time just getting other ships to actually understand what was happening and start making their way to Titanic. And then as the sinking continued to progress, more and more ships were becoming aware of the situation, and they all started transmitting at once, which was making it extremely difficult for Jack Phillips to actually respond to these other ships. So essentially, Jack Phillips is trying to send a signal using dots and dashes, and then he's getting consistently interrupted by other ships trying to transmit in. There's an incredible video called Titanic in Her Own Words on YouTube that actually takes these dots and dash signals and puts words on them so you can actually understand what is being said. So I'm going to play a small audio clip from that just so you get a taste as to all the chaos that Jack Phillips was dealing with that night.
Titanic, CQD. This is Virginia. CQD calling Titanic.
This is Titanic.
Cape Race to Virginia.
SOS.
Report to your captain.
SOS.
The Titanic has struck iceberg and requires immediate assistance.
Received. Olympic to Titanic.
CQD. SOS.
Olympic to Titanic.
This is Titanic.
Carpathia to
We
Titanic.
have struck an iceberg and are sinking.
We are coming your way.
SOS.
Coming at full speed.
CQD.
Doing 15 knots.
Received. Frankfurt to Titanic.
Yeah, so I think you guys get the idea. And one big thing you have to take away from this, if that sounds very chaotic to you, you have to remember, you're hearing an English translation of Morse code. So you can actually differentiate the different ships that are talking. As far as Jack Phillips was concerned, all he was hearing was different dots and dashes. So just imagine how hard it would be for him to actually differentiate all these different signals and try to let people know that the Titanic is in trouble. Anyway, a little bit later in that audio clip, Olympic, the Titanic sister ship, is also trying to message in, and he actually tells the operator on the Olympic, tells all the other radio operators to stop sending signals. He's like, Olympic to all stations, stop talking, you're jamming my signal, stop talking. And then the Olympic then tries to proceed to talk to Titanic. So it was very chaotic that night for Jack Phillips while he was trying to transmit the Titanic's distress call.
And the last person we're going to talk about in tonight's video is a man by the name of Charles Yawkins. He was a chef on board the RMS Titanic, and he has an incredible survival story. And the way he survived has to do with a role that he took upon himself during the sinking of the Titanic. You see, Charles Yawkins gave himself a personal mission while the ship was sinking, that the Titanic would go down with as little alcohol on board as possible.
You cannot make a sinking video about the RMS Titanic without talking about good old Charles Yawkins. So essentially his story is that he was going to have a place in a lifeboat, but he did surrender it to somebody else. And throughout the rest of the evening, he had no intention of surviving after that. So he decided that he was going to enjoy the evening as best he could. He went to the ship's pantry, got some wine, whiskey, whatever, and basically just went back to his stateroom and just kind of hung out, you know? He hung out in there for a while, drank the alcohol he had, went back up on deck or back to the pantry or wherever to get some more alcohol, came back to his room and found his room underwater. So he essentially just kind of hung out on the Titanic during the night of the sinking. And he was pretty buzzed, as understandably so. And his actions that night and the way, like his actions during the sinking, would have a huge impact on how he would, if in fact, actually survive the night. And I will talk more about that later after we get to the episode where the Titanic finally submerges. We'll mention Charles Yawkins again. But until then, I had to give you a little cliff note, so to speak, into Charles Yawkins and his role on the Titanic the night she went down.
It is 1:15 a.m. on the morning of April 15, 1912, on board the RMS Titanic. The Titanic has roughly 1 hour or so left to live before the ship finally sinks. And this time period represents another massive turning point in the sinking of this ship. If you take a look at the Titanic's port side as seen in this animation, you can just see the top part of the D-deck gangway door, which Lightoller opened about an hour or so before, finally dipping beneath the surface. And when this door finally slipped beneath the surface, it represented another massive turning point in the sinking of the RMS Titanic.
I'm going to give you a little bit more clarification as to why the D-deck gangway door on the Titanic being open that night was such a big deal. You see, the thing is, anytime you have a sinking ship, it could be the Titanic, it could be anything. Anytime you have another opening in the hull, that's another way that the water can gain further access to the ship. And it could be anything. It could be an air vent, it could be open porthole windows, whatever. Open porthole windows are especially bad on a sinking ship because that can actually change the outcome of a sinking. A good example of this would be the HMHS Britannic. You see, the Britannic, when it was damaged by the mine, the damage to the Britannic was very similar to that of the Titanic. Granted, in a different way than Titanic, but still, 6 compartments on the Britannic were compromised. But now, the builders of the Britannic had taken that into account after the Titanic disaster, so once the Britannic had sunk so far and she was about ready to stabilize, they had a ton of open porthole windows on the Britannic because it was a very hot day and hot steamship, etc., etc. So those open porthole windows, when they went underwater, that basically sealed the fate of Britannic. The water could now bypass all of the Britannic safety features, thus causing the ship to sink. Now, that wasn't the only reason the Britannic went down. There's other reasons as well, but you get the idea. The open porthole windows were a big factor in the sinking of the Britannic. Now, jumping back to the Titanic, there weren't a lot of open porthole windows on the Titanic that night because it was a very cold night. However, with the D-deck gangway door being open, it didn't really matter. So, let's explain the iceberg damage first so you get a little bit more clarification. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, she struck the iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline and damaged roughly 300 feet of her hull, so from the front of the ship to after the first funnel. And this huge amount of space on Titanic's hull got a bunch of small gashes and punctures from the iceberg impact. So they're not big openings, but there's a lot of them. That's why the Titanic was doomed. However, due to the size of the holes, it did limit the spread of water inside the Titanic just a bit. Now, the D-deck gangway door was on the Titanic's port side, so the opposite side of the iceberg damage. Iceberg damage was on starboard, the D-deck gangway door was on port. And when the water reached this D-deck gangway door, the problem was the actual size of the door. The door was huge. By some estimates, this one big hole that was put into the side of the Titanic by this door being open was bigger than all of the iceberg damage sustained on the Titanic by the iceberg combined. That is a huge amount of space. And just think about for a moment how much water that would allow to gain access to the inside of the Titanic. And what makes it even worse is the space of the Titanic that was right behind the D-deck gangway door. You see, right on the other side of that door, there was no hallways or passageways. It fed into a massive room called the reception room. So the water had immediate access to this massive space, and that greatly accelerated the sinking of the Titanic. I actually have an animation showcasing the space right behind the D-deck gangway door that immediately started flooding once it went under. I will show you that right now.
This is the D-deck gangway door as seen from the inside of the Titanic. And if you just walk a little bit further inside the ship, you'll now see the massive space that I was just talking about that exists just behind the door. This massive room is called the reception room, and it borders the first class dining room. And you can see how massive of a space this is. So that meant as soon as the D-deck gangway door went underwater and began to flood, this massive room would immediately begin taking on water. And then right beside this room, you have the first class dining room, another massive room. So just think about how much water was able to easily enter the Titanic once the D-deck gangway door went underwater. In this animation, you can plainly see the reception room beginning to flood. And boy, let me tell you, when I see this animation and I watch this room go underwater, and then I think back to the animation you saw earlier where this room was in perfect condition, you know, what it looked like pre-sinking, it sends shivers down my spine. I mean, honestly, I can't imagine how horrifying it must be to the people on board the Titanic watching this once beautiful room beginning to go underwater. Now, right around the time that the D-deck gangway door was beginning to go underwater, the sinking of the Titanic changed up a bit. You see, right around this time, the Titanic began developing a list to port. Now in this shot you see right here, the list to port isn't that noticeable yet, but you can kind of see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump the shot ahead around 5 to 10 minutes, just so you can see how much of a list to port the Titanic develops right around the time that the D-deck gangway door goes underwater. We've now jumped ahead around 15 minutes on board the RMS Titanic, so it's around 1:30 a.m. at this point. And as you can plainly see, the Titanic now has a very sharp list to port, and the D-deck gangway door is completely submerged at this point. So it's amazing how much the sinking of the Titanic has changed in the 15 minutes since the last animation was shown.
Now that we've explained the D-deck gangway door in detail and you understand the whole concept around it, I now want to talk about why the Titanic seemed to develop a very strong list to port right around the time that the D-deck gangway door went underwater. And honestly, I think I just answered my own question. I think it's because of the D-deck gangway door that the Titanic developed this very strong list to port right as it went under. And honestly, it makes sense. Remember, I told you that opening in the side of the ship was bigger than all of the iceberg damage combined. Not to mention you have those giant rooms right on the other side of that door. I mean, it makes sense that the D-deck gangway door going underwater would have the Titanic develop a list to port in that direction due to the rapid new source of water that was coming into the ship from the port side. But now that's not the only factor in this. I do think that even if the D-deck gangway door hadn't been opened, the Titanic would have developed a list to port at some point in the sinking. I think the D-deck gangway door being open just accelerated the process. Now, what am I referring to? Well, you see, deep inside the Titanic, there was a passageway called Scotland Road. And this passageway allowed the water to have another way to access further and deeper into the Titanic than it normally could.
Scotland Road is a long corridor on board the RMS Titanic located on E-deck of the port side, and this corridor spans most of the length of the ship, allowing the water to have a new way to access even further into the Titanic than it normally could.
So here's the thing to remember. Because of Scotland Road allowed the water that was flooding inside the Titanic to be able to traverse further back into the ship than it otherwise normally could. So the easiest way to explain it is like this. So the Titanic is flooding and it's got 6 compartments fully flooded and the water is beginning to flood into the 7th compartment. But because of Scotland Road, before the 7th compartment of Titanic is completely full of water, the water can already begin flooding the 8th and 9th compartments. So do you see what I'm saying? It's like Scotland Road allowed the water to have further access to the Titanic than it otherwise normally could. The water didn't have to wait for whatever compartment was flooding to be completely full before it could traverse further back inside the Titanic. And because Scotland Road was located on the port side of the ship, the Titanic would have a tendency to lean in that direction because the water that was flooding the further back sections of the Titanic would be flooding more heavily on the port side than starboard because Scotland Road was channeling the water into the port side. So yes, I think the Titanic would eventually have developed a list to port. However, due to the D-deck gangway door being opened, the process was greatly accelerated.
It is now 1:35 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and as you can clearly see, the water is now beginning to access the front part of the Titanic's deck. The water is just now beginning to itch its way over the bow of the Titanic, and this is another big turning point in the sinking. Throughout this whole video, we have been talking about how any kind of openings in the Titanic's hull would allow new ways for the water to access further and deeper into the ship. Well, at this point, with the water now itching its way onto the Titanic's bow and coming over the top of the deck, there are even more ways that the water can access the ship at this point. So that means the sinking of the Titanic is only going to accelerate from this point on. It is 1:40 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 1912 on board the RMS Titanic, and at this late stage in the sinking, events that are currently going on board the Titanic are really starting to get serious at this point. At this late stage in the sinking, all order on board the Titanic is beginning to break down. The passengers are beginning to panic because they realize there aren't enough lifeboats left on board. The officers are having a time trying to keep the crowds calm and keep everything organized so they can get the all too few lifeboats remaining on the Titanic away from the ship safely. I mean, at this late stage in the sinking, things are quickly falling apart on board the RMS Titanic, and the crew that are trying to get the lifeboats away are quickly running out of time before the Titanic sinks.
With order quickly beginning to break down on board the RMS Titanic, several of the Titanic's officers did in fact have to use guns as a means to actually protect the lifeboats from these crowds of people that are beginning to panic on board the ship. Now, one very important thing to keep in mind here, The White Star Line did not issue guns to the Titanic's officers. These officers just happened to bring guns on board with them when they boarded the ship, and they were using these guns to defend the lifeboats. And at this late stage in the sinking, with crowds and crowds of people coming up on the boat deck and realizing that there aren't enough lifeboats for everybody, yeah, they were beginning to panic. And there is nothing worse in a dangerous situation like on a sinking ship to have massive crowds of people panicking and not thinking clearly. You know, you have to maintain order. You have to keep order in a dangerous situation. You have to use your head, because if you panic and you try to rush and get things done quickly, that's when things go wrong. And when you have a massive crowd of people, and imagine if 50 or so people tried to rush one lifeboat. I mean, they could destroy that lifeboat. They could spill all of its occupants into the ocean. The lifeboat could break. The davits could break. There's 1,000 things that could go wrong. So it was very critical that the officers on board the Titanic do their best to try to keep the passengers calm and maintain order so they can try to launch the remaining few lifeboats that are still on board the Titanic.
Now, I did some checking, and as far as I can tell, I couldn't find any records of any passengers on board the Titanic actually being shot by any of the Titanic's officers in defense of the lifeboats. All of that stuff that we see in the James Cameron movie of Murdoch shooting some of the passengers and stuff before he shot himself, all of that appears to be made up just for the movie. And while we're talking about it, I do not believe Murdoch committed suicide like we see in the James Cameron film. So it does seem that while we do know for certain that shots were fired on the Titanic during the sinking, they were not at any particular passengers. They were just a warning measure in order to keep the crowds from rushing the Titanic's lifeboats.
Now that you have a pretty good concept at the events that are going on the boat deck of the Titanic at this current time, I now want to take our focus away from the boat deck and travel deep inside the Titanic and talk about the actions of some men who are still inside the ship, who I consider to be the unknown heroes of the Titanic disaster. And who am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to the brave men who are still deep inside the Titanic, in the Titanic's few remaining boiler rooms, and still in the engine room of the Titanic, fighting to keep the crucial systems of the Titanic functioning, like the power, the Marconi wireless, etc., etc.
You know, when you really think about it, it is unbelievable that even at this late stage in the sinking, the Titanic's power is still on. I mean, think about it. The entire front part of the Titanic is gone at this point. There's more parts of the Titanic that are currently underwater than there are above water. Yet, even at this late stage in the sinking, the Titanic's lights are still burning. The Marconi wireless is still transmitting, even though the signal is starting to get weak. And this is only possible due to the actions of the brave men that are still actively working in the Titanic's few remaining boiler rooms that aren't currently flooded, and still working in the Titanic's engine room. If these men hadn't done what they were doing, the Titanic would have lost power long ago, and I don't think even half of the number of people who survived the disaster would have been able to get off the Titanic before she sank. Another thing that's incredible about the men who are still working in the Titanic's boiler rooms and engine room at this late stage in the sinking is the fact that they were not ordered to stay behind. At this point during the sinking, the men who are still working to keep the Titanic afloat and keep the power on are there only on a purely volunteer basis at this point.
Joseph Bell, the chief engineer on board the RMS Titanic, had actually went into the Titanic's flooding boiler rooms and engine room and told the men that they could try to go up on deck and save themselves. However, he was going to stay behind, and he needed men to stay behind with him and help him try to keep the Titanic's critical systems working. He told them that he needed steam for the pumps, for the electricity, etc., etc. And if any men would volunteer to stay behind and help him keep the ship's systems running, he would appreciate it, but they were not ordered to. And even though a good number of men did leave and they headed up on deck to try to save themselves, a good number of men did stay behind and help Joseph Bell keep the Titanic's critical systems functioning until the very last minute. And honestly, I can't even imagine what kind of courage that would take to do that. I mean, just think about it. If you were one of the officers up on the deck of the Titanic trying to get the lifeboats launched, you know, even though you're not leaving the Titanic and you're launching lifeboats, you still have a shot at surviving, because once the ship goes down, you know, you've got a chance to find something to climb onto, make your way to a lifeboat. You have options if you're on the deck of the Titanic when she goes down. But if you're one of the men in the engine room or in the boiler rooms deep inside the ship, when the Titanic founders, it's taking you with her. So, I mean, if you're inside the ship just trying to keep the systems functioning, you have no chance of survival. And the men who volunteered to stay behind knew this. And Joseph Bell, and along with other key members of the engineering staff, all the men who were still inside the Titanic at this late stage in the sinking, trying to keep the power going, they were never found. So it's most likely that all of them did in fact go down with the Titanic when she finally sank. And they are truly the unknown heroes of the RMS Titanic disaster, and they should get a lot more praise than what they really do in the modern era.
It is currently 1:50 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. The bow section of the ship is completely submerged at this point, and the water is continuing to itch its way higher and higher up the deck of the Titanic. And you know, whenever I look at animations of the sinking of the Titanic, the one thing that stands out to me the most is the fact that even at this late stage in the sinking, there are still lifeboats leaving the Titanic. Remember, it's 1:50 a.m. and the Titanic sinks at 2:20. So the crew has basically 30 minutes left to finish launching all of the Titanic's lifeboats before the ship sinks. Really, they have less time than that because during the last 10 minutes of the ship's life, there was so much chaos on board that they couldn't launch any lifeboats. And whenever you talk to people today about the sinking of the Titanic and you ask them, why do you think so many people died that night? 9 times out of 10, what they will say is it was because the Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats on board. However, I disagree with that statement. I think that if the Titanic had enough lifeboats for everyone on board, the crew would not have had time to launch them. You see, in reality, the Titanic had 20 lifeboats on board, but the crew only managed to launch 18 of them. The last 2 lifeboats on the Titanic had to be floated off. So even if the Titanic had enough lifeboats for everyone on board, there really is no way the crew would have had enough time to launch all the lifeboats before the Titanic sank.
So that's the big thing to take away from this. What good is it to have enough lifeboats for everybody on board if you don't have enough time to launch them? Now, don't take this out of context. I do believe that ships need to go out to sea with enough lifeboats for everybody on board. But what I'm saying is, just because you have enough lifeboats for everybody on board doesn't mean you're immediately going to save everybody that's on a ship before she sinks. Now, in the case of Titanic, the Titanic was designed to have enough lifeboats for everybody on board, but the Titanic did not have a good method to actually prep and launch all the lifeboats. Sure, the davits on board were good for what they had, but if they had enough lifeboats for everybody on board, the lifeboats would have been stacked all around the deck. And if the crew had to deal with moving those lifeboats out of the way and, trying to prep them and all that, the crew would have had twice as much work to do before they could actually attempt to start launching lifeboats. And with the 20 lifeboats the Titanic had on board, the crew was actually able to start launching lifeboats within an hour, because all they had to do was find out that the ship was sinking, prep the boats, and start launching them. They didn't have to move lifeboats around, and you know what I mean. So if the Titanic had enough lifeboats for everybody on board, I don't think they would have been able to get at least half of them off of the ship before she went down. And for those of you thinking, okay, it's no big deal if they couldn't launch all the lifeboats, they could just float the lifeboats off the ship after it sank. Titanic went down in a very violent way. If there were any lifeboats still on the ship at the time of her final plunge, it's most likely that most of them would have just gotten destroyed by the ship breaking up. It's not like they could just float all the boats off. The Titanic, especially during the final stages when the ship is climbing higher and higher, any lifeboats on the ship would have been destroyed at that point. So, honestly, for what they had to work with on the Titanic the night she went down, the number of lifeboats it had, the amount of time that they had to actually prep and launch the lifeboats, I think the officers who launched the boats that night did what I would consider be the near impossible. They successfully launched 18 of the 20 lifeboats on board the Titanic before the ship went down.
It is now 1:55 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. The Titanic is about to enter the final stages of the sinking process. But before we get into that, I thought we would first jump back and talk about the Titanic's 2 wireless operators again, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. We have already discussed them in an earlier video, but a lot has happened with them since I first commented on them a few episodes ago. So I thought we would jump back to them and talk about what's been happening with them and what they are currently doing during these final stages of the sinking of the Titanic.
Now, even though the Titanic did have 2 wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, it was only Jack Phillips who was on the radio that night. Harold Bride was in the room with him, but he was more or less just doing office work that evening, making sure the Marconi wireless kept power, delivering messages to the captain and other members of the Titanic's crew, and going out on deck and letting Jack know what was going on, etc., etc. Now, throughout the course of the evening, as the Titanic was continuing to sink, Jack Phillips began having mental breakdowns as the sinking of the Titanic progressed. You see, in his mind, all 2,200 people on board the Titanic, their lives were resting on his shoulders. It was his job to get another ship to the Titanic before it sank. If he didn't do his duty and get another vessel to Titanic before she went down, if all 2,200 people died that night, it would be his fault. And the pressure of that knowledge he had, you know, him thinking that, it was beginning to cause him to snap. And honestly, I can understand why. Who wouldn't in that situation? So, because he was under this mindset, he wasn't really aware of his surroundings. And Harold Bride, who was in the room with him, was getting increasingly frustrated with Jack. You know, Jack was kind of ignoring him. He wasn't really talking to Harold Bride anymore. And all the while, Jack is just continuing to try to transmit the Titanic's distress call. Now, what made this even worse was during the final stages of the sinking, as the Titanic was increasingly losing power, there was a point where the Titanic wasn't transmitting anymore, and Jack Phillips didn't notice. He's still sitting there pounding away on the Marconi wireless trying to transmit, and he doesn't even realize the Titanic isn't sending the signal anymore.
While Harold Bride was arguing with Jack Phillips about whether or not to abandon the wireless room at this late stage in the sinking, the two men were paid a visit by Captain Smith. This is one of the final confirmed sightings of Captain Smith during the sinking. The captain basically told the two men that they had done their full duty, they could do no more, and it was time for them to abandon their cabin. It was every man for himself. And then the captain walked out of the Marconi wireless room without saying another word. At that point, Harold Bride told Jack, "Didn't you hear the captain? It's time to abandon ship. We have to go." But Jack Phillips was ignoring him and continuing to try to transmit. The two men would end up staying in the Marconi wireless room for another 10 minutes or so before they actually abandoned the cabin.
Now, when I say the two men chose to stay in the wireless room for a little bit longer, it was mostly Jack Phillips refusing to leave and Harold Bride not wanting to abandon his friend. That's basically all it was. Now, right up to this point in the sinking, Harold Bride was becoming increasingly aware at how dire their situation was. Harold Bride knew that if they did not abandon their cabin soon, then they would have no chance at surviving the night. But Jack Phillips was just completely not listening to him. So, right up to this point, Jack Phillips didn't even have a life jacket on. He was just sitting at the desk trying to transmit. So Harold Bride went and got a life jacket from the other room and basically force-tied it to Jack Phillips. You know, tied it around him and stuff and just basically made him put it on. All the while, Jack Phillips is transmitting. Now, right after Harold Bride did that, he walked into the other room, and then when he came back, he found a random passenger in the wireless room, no joke, trying to untie and steal the life jacket off of Jack Phillips. And Jack Phillips, being completely oblivious to everything that's going on, wasn't even aware that this guy was trying to steal his life jacket. Now, upon seeing this, Harold Bride did tackle the guy, and a big fight broke out in the wireless room, and this woke up Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride together were able to stop this guy, and they basically knocked him out cold in the wireless room. Now, once this guy was on the floor, you would think that they would abandon the cabin at this point. But nope, Jack Phillips got up, went right back to the desk, and continued to try to transmit the Titanic's distress call.
It is now 2 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic on the morning of April 15, 1912. And remember, the RMS Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m., so the ship has roughly 20 minutes left before the ship finally sinks. Now, the crew that are still on board the Titanic, they realistically only have about 5 to 10 minutes left before the sinking of the Titanic becomes too unstable and they aren't able to work anymore. Now, at this late stage in the sinking, the RMS Titanic still has 4 lifeboats on board: collapsible A, B, C, and D. Collapsible A and B are on the roof of the officers' quarters by the Titanic's first funnel, and collapsible C and D are located on the Titanic's side, currently being launched from the Titanic by the ship's davits.
Now, I know in the last video we went into detail about how the crew barely had enough time to launch all the lifeboats on the Titanic before she went down, and honestly, they didn't have enough time to launch all the lifeboats. Remember, only 18 of the 20 lifeboats were launched. Now, I can understand why collapsible A and B on board the Titanic, those lifeboats, were not launched from the ship. I understand why they had to be floated off, because their position on the Titanic wasn't that easy for the crew to access. Collapsible A and B were located right beside the first funnel on the roof of the officers' quarters. So those lifeboats weren't easy for the crew to access. Now, when it comes to all 18 other lifeboats, the 2 lifeboats that are still on the ship at 2 a.m. that are still connected to the davits, those lifeboats were in a good position to be launched. All the other lifeboats on the Titanic were in a place where they could be easily accessed by the crew and launched. And it was still 2 a.m. before they managed to get all those lifeboats off. I mean, it's unbelievable, really. That just goes to show how hard the crew worked on the Titanic to get those 18 of those 20 lifeboats off of the Titanic. And as I said in the last video, I think the crew of the Titanic should get a lot of praise that night for doing what I considered to be the near impossible.
Now, the lifeboat you see in this animation getting ready to leave the ship is Collapsible C. Now, as Collapsible C was being lowered away from the Titanic, this lifeboat was being launched from the Titanic's starboard side. However, due to the very sharp list that the Titanic had to port at this late stage in the sinking, the entire time that this lifeboat was being lowered away, this boat was literally grinding or rubbing against the hull of the Titanic, threatening to cause this lifeboat to capsize, spilling all of its occupants into the ocean. I mean, honestly, can you imagine how scary it must have been for the people in this lifeboat during the actual launching of this lifeboat from the Titanic? It is currently 2:05 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and at this late stage in the sinking, the Titanic's power levels have dropped so low that the Marconi wireless that is being used to broadcast the Titanic's distress call no longer functions. It's also at this time that the last lifeboat to leave the Titanic, Collapsible D, as seen in this animation, finally leaves the ship. And man, if you just take a look at this animation and you see how close the water is to the Titanic's boat deck and bridge, I mean, honestly, this really does go to show that the crew was literally working till the very last minute to try to get as many lifeboats as they could off of the Titanic before she sank.
Now, Collapsible D actually has another interesting story that goes along with it right as soon as this lifeboat was leaving the Titanic. As you saw in that last animation, when Collapsible D touched the water was very close to the Titanic's boat deck and bridge, being only one deck below. The water is right around here, right where my finger is, just on the deck below the boat deck. And when this lifeboat touched the water, it was right beside this part of the deck, with part of this deck already being submerged. And there were these two men who actually came out from inside the Titanic and saw Collapsible D getting ready to pull away from the Titanic. So what these two men did was they actually walked out onto a part of this deck, which is already submerged, right beside Collapsible D, and climbed over the Titanic's railing and got into this lifeboat before it left the ship. Now, on the boat deck above them, or on the deck right above them, Lightoller saw all this. He saw these two men come out of the ship, he saw them walk out onto a submerged part of the Titanic's deck, climb over the railing, and get into this lifeboat. And he didn't, but he almost ordered those two men to get off of that lifeboat and get back on the Titanic. He did decide to let them go, but he almost ordered them out. I mean, come on, Lightoller. I mean, at least you did let the men go, I will say that, but at this point, you know, there's empty seats in that lifeboat. These two men see the empty seats and they just climb into the boat. They're not threatening anybody. I don't get why you would even think for a moment to stop these two men from getting into the lifeboat.
It is currently 2:09 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic. At this time on the ship, the wireless room is abandoned, so Jack Phillips and Harold Bride are now heading out, and Collapsible Lifeboat A, as seen in this animation, is pushed off of the roof of the officers' quarters down to the regular boat deck of the Titanic.
Now, the reason the officers decided to push Collapsible A off of the roof of the officers' quarters and down to the regular boat deck was because they wanted to attempt to launch this lifeboat the same way they had launched all the other lifeboats throughout the sinking. They did not know at this time how close they were to the end of the Titanic's life. Now, once they pushed Collapsible A off of the roof of the officers' quarters down to the boat deck, they began tying the lifeboat to the davits and beginning the process to correctly launch this lifeboat. However, as soon as the lifeboat hit the deck, at this late stage in the sinking, crowds were beginning to panic, and this lifeboat kind of got rushed with people. So people were already boarding this lifeboat before the lifeboat was even ready to be launched. And what these people didn't realize is that on the other side of the ship, hidden from view, the water was already beginning to itch its way up onto the boat deck. So the people who were working on Collapsible A really only had about 1 to 2 minutes left before the water reached them, and it would be too late to launch this lifeboat.
It is now 2:10 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and at this time, this is when the last known sighting of Captain Smith and the Titanic's designer Thomas Andrews was reported. Right around this time, they were both seen on the Titanic's bridge, and Captain Smith said to Thomas Andrews, "There's no sense in waiting any longer. She's going. It's time to go." Captain Smith and Thomas Andrews' last confirmed location was them jumping over the bridge wing of the Titanic as the bridge of the ship was beginning to submerge.
Now, also around 2:10 a.m., this is the time frame at which it's believed the Titanic's band started playing Near My God to Thee. We don't know the exact time frame at which it happened, but we do know it was somewhere around 2:10. Now, also around this time, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the Titanic's 2 wireless operators, finally emerged from their cabin. I mean, the Titanic had stopped transmitting some 5 to 10 minutes before, and only now did those 2 men finally come out of the wireless room and get out onto the boat deck. Now, in all the chaos that was beginning to start up on the Titanic's boat deck, Harold Bride lost Jack Phillips. Jack Phillips just disappeared into the crowd, and Harold Bride had no clue what happened to him. And while Harold Bride was looking around for him on the boat deck, something happened to Harold Bride that he did not expect.
Around the time that Harold Bride was on the Titanic's boat deck looking for Jack Phillips, other members of the Titanic's crew were on the roof of the officers' quarters trying to push Collapsible B off of the roof and down to the boat deck. And as Harold Bride was on the Titanic's deck looking for Jack Phillips, they succeeded in pushing Collapsible B off of the roof of the officers' quarters and down to the boat deck, and it actually fell and landed upside down on top of Harold Bride. So essentially, he is now trapped underneath an upside-down lifeboat on the rapidly sinking Titanic.
Boy, I tell you, after hearing all this about Harold Bride, I mean, he had a time that night. I mean, think about it. He's watching his friend slowly losing his mind throughout the course of the evening. He fights off a random guy in the wireless room who's trying to steal his buddy's life jacket. He goes out onto the Titanic's boat deck, sees the ship rapidly sinking, loses his friend, and then on top of that, a lifeboat gets dropped on top of him and he gets stuck underneath it. And everyone, he never got out of there. He did eventually get out of that overturned lifeboat, but it wasn't until the Titanic sunk so far that the lifeboat literally floated off of him, and he just swam out from underneath and climbed up on top of it. And Harold Bride would end up surviving the evening. I'm telling you, if you ask me, Harold Bride has one of the craziest survival stories of the entire Titanic disaster.
Now that you know everything that's going on with Collapsible Lifeboat B on the Titanic's port side, let's head back over to the Titanic's starboard side and talk about Collapsible A again. Remember how I told you earlier that they attempted to tie this lifeboat to the Titanic's davits and launch it just like all the other lifeboats? Well, by now they realized their mistake, and they realized that they did not have enough time to do this. However, this lifeboat is still tied to the Titanic's davits, and the ship is sinking so quickly at this point that it's threatening to drag this lifeboat down with the Titanic. They had to use knives and guns, whatever they had available, to free this lifeboat before the Titanic eventually took the lifeboat with it, and they did succeed in doing this. However, once this lifeboat was free, the Titanic's first funnel began to fall, missing Collapsible B, the overturned lifeboat on the port side, by inches. Now, once the first funnel fell, it generated a huge wave that actually helped push Collapsible A and B away from the Titanic before she went down.
Now, with any new opening that exists in the Titanic's hull, whether it be from, the windows breaking or the first funnel coming down, with any new opening in the hull, you are going to cause the sinking of the Titanic to just accelerate. Now, at this late stage in the sinking, there's not much you could do to make the ship sink any quicker than it already is, but still, with the first funnel gone, the Titanic was still going to slightly accelerate and begin to sink a little faster. Now, right around this time, water was beginning to rapidly flood inside of the Titanic's grand staircase. And for those of you who don't know, this rectangular structure you see right here in front of the second funnel, this is what housed the grand staircase dome. Now, as soon as this part of the Titanic was getting ready to go under where the grand staircase was, there was a man standing really close to it by the name of Archibald Gracie. And he said that right after the first funnel came down, a massive wave shot up over the boat deck and came over the grand staircase where he was. And in order to keep himself from being washed overboard, he grabs onto this railing and tries to hang on to the Titanic. But what he doesn't realize was that this wave wasn't a wave. It was that section of the ship dipping beneath the surface. So now he's holding onto a railing on a part of the Titanic that's already submerged. And then he said he felt this huge suction beginning to try to pull him underwater with the Titanic. And because he was standing right around this rectangular structure where the grand staircase dome was, I believe that is evidence that the grand staircase dome actually imploded and rapidly flooded, just like we see in the James Cameron film.
It is currently 2:15 a.m. on board the RMS Titanic, and at this time the second funnel of the Titanic began to collapse, and when it fell, it erupted into a shower of sparks and fire, as described by a Titanic survivor by the name of Jack Thayer. There is a lot of debate to this day as to what could have caused the second funnel to erupt like this when it fell. Some people think it was coal dust igniting. I kind of think it might have had something to do with some boilers that were still inside the Titanic and pressurized, and they could have had a small-scale boiler explosion, which could have caused the second funnel to fall like this. But we will never know. It's a topic that is highly debated to this day.
Now, right around the time that the Titanic's second funnel fell, this is also the time period at which the Titanic's stern began to start rapidly climbing up and rising out of the water. And this is because at this late stage in the sinking, the whole bow section, which is now underwater, is essentially just dead weight that wants to drop to the bottom of the ocean. But at this point, the stern is still more or less 100% buoyant, and it's fighting the dead weight of the bow. So as the bow begins to drop lower and lower into the ocean, the stern is just rising up higher and higher, going with the bow. And the air inside the stern is preventing the stern from just dropping at this point. Now, all of this is putting a huge amount of strain on the Titanic's hull. And the only reason the stern doesn't, at this late stage, just go completely vertical is because of the Titanic's center of mass. You see, the Titanic's center of mass isn't the center of the ship. It's actually in between the third and fourth funnel where the heaviest object on the ship is, and that would be the Titanic's engines. And that's a big reason as to why the Titanic actually ended up floating for so long during the sinking. It's because the engines, where they were the heaviest things on the ship, they were actually counteracting the flooding in the Titanic's bow section throughout the entire sinking. So if the Titanic had actually started sinking from the back instead of the front, the Titanic wouldn't have lasted an hour. With the weight of the incoming water and the weight of the Titanic's engines, the Titanic would just sink really quick. But because the Titanic flooded in the front section and the engines were in the back, it kind of created a stabilization effect, so to speak, keeping the Titanic on more or less an even keel until very close to the end of the sinking.
But as the stern of the Titanic continues to climb higher and higher out of the water, this puts more and more strain on the Titanic's hull. Survivors of the Titanic disaster later said that once the ship reached this point in the sinking, it sounded like the ship was literally tearing itself apart. Survivors could literally hear the steel structure of the Titanic beginning to fail. And then finally at 2:19 a.m. it happened. Survivors of the Titanic's disaster said they heard what sounded like a very loud explosion, and then they saw the stern of the Titanic settle back. What just happened was the Titanic suffered a massive structural failure and the entire ship broke in half. Now amazingly, just after the breakup, the Titanic's main power system did go out, but the Titanic's emergency generator did kick in, keeping a few emergency lights on in the stern section throughout the rest of the sinking.
Now, when the Titanic broke in half, it didn't completely separate the bow section from the stern section. Essentially what happened was the entire structure of the ship from the front all the way down to nearly the bottom of the ship broke apart. You see, the bottom of the Titanic has a layer on it called the double bottom. It's this really strong part of the Titanic structure. The double bottom spans the entire length of the ship from the bow to the stern. And everything but the double bottom failed. So the double bottom is still holding the bow section to the Titanic stern section briefly after the breakup. We don't know exactly how long these two sections of the ship held together, but we do know it was a little bit after the breakup. Because right after the breakup, the Titanic stern settled back, but then as the bow continued to drop to the seafloor, the double bottom, at least briefly, began to pull the stern vertical. As I said, we don't know for how long, or we don't know how long the double bottom actually remained connected to the bow and stern, but we do know that it was long enough to allow the stern to at least begin to go vertical once the Titanic broke in half.
And then at 2:20 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 1912, 2 hours and 40 minutes after the collision with the iceberg, the Titanic's stern, now going nearly completely vertical, begins to slip beneath the surface, taking 1,500 souls that are still on board the Titanic into the freezing cold North Atlantic Ocean.
All right, everybody. Well, hey, I'm going to wrap up the video here. I just wanted to take a quick moment to thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this entire series that I've been working on the entire story of the RMS Titanic. For all of you who have been watching this series from the first episode when the Titanic left Belfast to up to now with the Titanic finally slipping beneath the surface, I just wanted to thank you all for all your support. This was definitely the most ambitious project that I ever took on this channel to date. And I just wanted to thank you all for coming on this ride with me and just enjoying my videos and just supporting what I do. It really, really means a lot, guys. Now, as I said earlier, I am going to crop all of these videos together into one giant documentary film, so stay tuned for that. But yep, guys, all right, well, hey, with Titanic Month coming to a close, before I say goodbye, I would like just to dedicate this video to all the victims who lost their lives on the night that the RMS Titanic went down. It's a very sad story, and I hope that we as a people, especially those who are really interested in the Titanic, I hope that we can learn a lot from the Titanic disaster, and we can move forward with the hope that something like that will never happen to anyone ever again. All right, everybody. Well, hey, thank you all so much for watching, and you all stay safe out there. All right, everybody. Well, hey, I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night, everybody.